Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we delve into the chilling story of Fred and Rose West, a couple whose names became synonymous with unimaginable horror. Between 1967 and 1987, they sexually assaulted and murdered at least 12 women and girls, including members of their own family. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the ordinariness of the perpetrators, a seemingly normal family living on a respectable street, hiding darkness behind lace curtains and garden gates. Let me take you back to where it all began, to understand how two individuals from troubled backgrounds would come together to create a reign of terror that lasted over 2 decades. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, in the village of Muchmarkel, Herefordshire. To the outside world, the Wests appeared to be a typical farming family, but behind closed doors, a different reality existed. Fred's childhood was marked by poverty, violence, and alleged sexual abuse. His father, Walter West, was a strict disciplinarian with rumored inappropriate relationships with his daughters. His mother, Daisy, was largely absent emotionally, leaving young Fred to navigate a world where boundaries seemed fluid and morality was negotiable. Fred was not a bright child by academic standards, but he possessed a certain cunning that would serve him well in darker pursuits. As a teenager, he developed an obsession with sex that bordered on compulsion. Local rumors suggested inappropriate behavior with animals and younger children, though these allegations were never formally investigated at the time. It was as if the village collectively chose to look the other way, perhaps sensing something disturbing in the young man but lacking the courage or knowledge to confront it. By his early 20s, Fred had already begun to show signs of the predatory behavior that would define his life. He was charming when he needed to be, particularly with young women who were vulnerable or seeking attention. His approach was calculated. He would identify girls who were lonely, from broken homes, or simply naive about the dangers that existed in the world. In 1962, Fred married Catherine Bernadette Costello, known as Rena, a young woman from Scotland who was already pregnant with another man's child. Fred's willingness to marry a pregnant woman might have seemed generous to some, but it was actually strategic. Rena's vulnerability made her easier to control, and Fred quickly established a pattern of dominance that would characterize all his relationships. The marriage was turbulent from the beginning. Rena gave birth to Charmaine in March 1963, and though Fred was not the biological father, he treated the child as his own, at least initially. The family moved frequently, often staying just ahead of debts, complaints, or suspicions about Fred's behavior. In 1964, Rena gave birth to Anna Marie, Fred's biological daughter, but even the arrival of his own child didn't stabilize the relationship. Fred's sexual appetites were insatiable and increasingly disturbing. He began pressuring Rena into prostitution, initially framing it as a financial necessity but clearly deriving pleasure from controlling and degrading her. When Rena resisted or tried to assert independence, Fred would become violent. Neighbors occasionally heard screaming from their various addresses, but this was an era when domestic disputes were considered private matters. By the late 1960s, the marriage was effectively over. Rena had begun using drugs heavily, partly as an escape from her reality, and Fred had started seeking other victims for his twisted desires. The stage was set for an escalation that would have devastating consequences for many innocent people. While Fred's darkness was developing in Herefordshire and later Gloucester, another troubled soul was growing up just miles away. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Barnstaple, Devon, the fifth of 7 children in a deeply dysfunctional family. Her father, Bill Letts, was a paranoid schizophrenic with violent tendencies who had served time in prison. Her mother, Daisy Letts, suffered severe depression and underwent electroshock therapy while pregnant with Rose, a treatment that may have contributed to the child's later psychological problems. Rose's childhood was marked by chaos, violence, and instability. Bill Letts ruled the household with an iron fist, subjecting his wife and children to physical and emotional abuse. Rose learned early that violence was a normal part of relationships, that power came through intimidation, and that the strong preyed upon the weak. She also developed an early and inappropriate interest in sex, displaying behaviors that concerned teachers and social workers but were never adequately addressed. Unlike Fred, who could be charming when necessary, Rose was often sullen, aggressive, and difficult to like. She struggled in school, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she seemed fundamentally disconnected from normal social interactions. Other children found her strange and somewhat frightening, though they couldn't always articulate why. In early 1969, when Rose was just 15 years old, she met Fred West at a bus stop in Cheltenham. Fred was 27, married with children, and immediately recognized something in the teenager that appealed to his twisted sensibilities. Rose was young, vulnerable, and had been conditioned by her upbringing to accept violence and control as normal parts of relationships. The attraction was mutual, though for different reasons. Rose saw in Fred an escape from her chaotic family life, while Fred saw in Rose someone he could mold and control completely. Their relationship began immediately and intensely, with Rose moving in with Fred despite the significant age difference and the fact that he was still married to Rena. What made their partnership particularly dangerous was how their individual pathologies complemented each other. Fred was the planner and manipulator, able to charm potential victims and think strategically about covering up crimes. Rose provided the raw violence and sadistic pleasure in causing pain. Together, they created something far more dangerous than either would have been alone. By 1970, Fred and Rose were living together more or less full-time, though Fred was still technically married to Rena. Rose had dropped out of school and was completely under Fred's influence, participating in his increasingly dangerous sexual games and helping him target vulnerable young women. Their first known victim together was probably Anna McFall, an 18-year-old Scottish nanny who had been caring for Charmaine and Anna Marie. Anna was exactly the type of young woman who appealed to Fred, pretty, naive, and without strong family connections to pursue her if she disappeared. She had developed genuine affection for the children and may have believed that Fred would eventually divorce Rena and marry her. In July 1967, Anna McFall was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child when she disappeared. Fred later claimed she had simply left, but decades later, her remains would be found buried in a field near Muchmarkel, along with those of her unborn baby. The level of mutilation found on her body suggested that her death was not quick or merciful. This murder established a pattern that would repeat many times over the following years. Fred and Rose would identify a vulnerable young woman, usually someone without strong family ties or someone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. They would gain the victim's trust, often offering help or accommodation, then subject her to prolonged sexual torture before killing her. The selection process was methodical. They preferred victims who were runaways, sex workers, or young women who had strained relationships with their families. They understood instinctively that society was less likely to search vigorously for these disposable people, and that their disappearances would be attributed to the transient lifestyle many of them lived. In 1971, another tragedy occurred that would haunt the case for decades. 8-year-old Charmaine, Rena's daughter from her previous relationship, disappeared while Fred was serving a short prison sentence for theft. Rose is believed to have killed Charmaine shortly before Fred's prison release date of June 24, 1971. The little girl had been difficult to control, asking questions about her mother and showing signs of distress about the increasingly chaotic household. When neighbors asked about Charmaine, Rose calmly explained that the child had gone to live with her mother. It was a plausible story. Many children in their social circle moved frequently between parents and relatives. What the neighbors didn't know was that Rena was already dead, murdered by Fred sometime in 1971, and that Charmaine's body was buried in the cellar of their previous home on Midland Road. In late 1972, Fred and Rose moved to 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, a three-story Victorian terrace house that would become synonymous with their crimes. The house seemed perfect for their purposes. It was in a respectable working-class neighborhood, but the Victorian design provided plenty of hidden spaces and soundproofing. The cellar, in particular, would prove crucial to their activities. Fred, who was skilled in construction and renovation work, immediately began modifying the house to suit their needs. He installed soundproofing in certain rooms, created hidden spaces, and most ominously, began preparing areas where bodies could be concealed. To neighbors, it appeared that Fred was simply an industrious homeowner improving his property. Rose, meanwhile, was establishing herself as a mother and homemaker, though her version of domesticity was far from normal. She gave birth to Heather in 1970, May in 1972, and would go on to have several more children by Fred and other men. The West children grew up in an atmosphere of fear, violence, and sexual abuse, never knowing when Rose's volatile temper would explode or when Fred would decide one of them needed punishment. The house on Cromwell Street operated on multiple levels. To the outside world, it was home to a large, boisterous family where Fred worked construction jobs and Rose managed the household. Neighbors might have noticed that the West seemed to have a lot of young female lodgers who came and went frequently, but in the 1970s, this wasn't particularly unusual for a household needing extra income. What neighbors didn't know was that many of these lodgers never left the house alive. Fred and Rose had perfected a system of luring vulnerable young women to the house, usually under the pretense of offering accommodation or work. Once inside, the victims would be subjected to prolonged torture, sexual abuse, and eventually murder. The basement became their primary killing ground. Fred had installed special restraints and torture devices, creating what can only be described as a private chamber of horrors. The soundproofing he had installed meant that screams and pleas for help would never reach the outside world. Between 1973 and 1979, at least 9 young women disappeared from the Gloucester area, all with connections to the West household. The first of these victims, 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper, was abducted on November 10, 1973. Cooper lived in the Pines Children's Home in Worcester and was particularly vulnerable because she had no family actively looking for her. Each murder followed a similar pattern. The victim would be lured to the house, restrained in the basement, and subjected to prolonged torture that could last for hours or even days. Fred seemed to derive particular pleasure from the psychological aspect of the torture, often telling victims exactly what he planned to do to them and describing the fates of previous victims. Rose's role in these murders was more than passive. She actively participated in the torture and seemed to take sadistic pleasure in the victim's suffering. Some survivors who escaped the West household described Rose as even more frightening than Fred because her violence seemed more unpredictable and emotionally driven. As the 1970s progressed, the disappearances around Gloucester continued, but the pattern was subtle enough that police didn't initially connect them. The victims were typically young women from unstable backgrounds, runaways, care home residents, or those involved in prostitution. Society's prejudices worked in the West's favor, as these women were often dismissed as having simply moved on or gotten into trouble elsewhere. Lucy Partington was different. In December 1973, the 21-year-old university student and niece of novelist Kingsley Amis disappeared after visiting friends in Cheltenham. Lucy was intelligent, came from a middle-class family, and had a bright future ahead of her. Her disappearance generated significant media attention and police investigation, but despite extensive searches, no trace of her was found. What investigators didn't know was that Lucy had likely been abducted by the Wests while waiting for a bus. She spent her final days in the basement of 25 Cromwell Street, subjected to the same horrific treatment as the other victims. Her remains would eventually be found buried in the garden, showing evidence of the systematic torture that had become the West's signature. Teresa Siegenthaler, a 21-year-old Swiss student, disappeared in April 1974 while hitchhiking from London to Ireland. She had been backpacking through Europe, trusting in the kindness of strangers, a trust that would prove fatal when she encountered the Wests. Her body was found decades later in the garden of 25 Cromwell Street, bearing the same horrific injuries as the other victims. Shirley Hubbard, just 15 years old, vanished in November 1974 while working as a shop assistant in Worcester. She had been living in foster care and was described as a sweet, trusting girl who was excited about her new job and independence. The Wests targeted her specifically because of her vulnerability and lack of strong family connections. Juanita Mott disappeared in April 1975. The 18-year-old had been living rough and involved in prostitution, making her an ideal victim in the West's twisted logic. She had stayed at 25 Cromwell Street before, which made her return seem natural to any neighbors who might have noticed. Shirley Robinson was perhaps the most tragic case because she had genuinely believed she was safe. The 18-year-old had been living at 25 Cromwell Street as a lodger and had become pregnant with Fred's child. She may have thought this gave her special protection, or that Fred would choose her over Rose. Instead, her pregnancy made her a threat to Rose's position in the household, and in 1978, both Shirley and her unborn baby were murdered and buried in the garden. Each of these murders demonstrated the West's complete lack of empathy or remorse. They didn't just kill these young women, they tortured them extensively, took pleasure in their suffering, and treated their bodies with complete disrespect after death. The level of sadism involved suggests that the murders weren't just about eliminating witnesses or satisfying sexual urges, they had become an entertainment, a source of psychological gratification. While the Wests were systematically murdering young women, they were also raising a large family at 25 Cromwell Street. By the early 1980s, Rose had given birth to 8 children, not all of whom were Fred's. The household was chaotic, violent, and sexually abusive, creating an environment where normal childhood development was impossible. The West children lived in constant fear. Rose's temper was explosive and unpredictable. She might beat a child savagely for a minor infraction one day, then ignore serious misbehavior the next. Fred's discipline was different but equally damaging, often involving sexual abuse disguised as punishment or education. What made the situation even more horrifying was that the children were living directly above and alongside their parents' torture chamber. They heard sounds from the basement that they couldn't understand, smelled odors that they couldn't identify, and lived with a constant underlying sense of dread that something terrible was happening in their home. Anna Marie, Fred's eldest daughter with Rena, bore the brunt of the abuse as she grew into adolescence. Fred began sexually assaulting her when she was just 8 years old, justifying it as normal father-daughter behavior or as preparation for adult relationships. Rose not only knew about the abuse but actively participated in it, seeing Anna Marie as competition rather than as a child who needed protection. The other children learned quickly that silence was survival. Speaking about what they witnessed or experienced brought punishment, while compliance and secrecy were rewarded with relative safety. They developed a complex system of signals and codes to warn each other about their parents' moods and to protect the younger children when possible. In 1987, another family tragedy occurred that would eventually lead to the West's downfall. Heather West, Fred and Rose's eldest daughter together, had grown into a strong-willed teenager who was beginning to resist her parents' control. At 16, she was talking about leaving home, moving in with friends, and possibly reporting the abuse she had suffered to authorities. Fred and Rose couldn't allow Heather to leave, knowing that she possessed enough information to destroy them completely. On June 17, 1987, they murdered their own daughter in the basement of 25 Cromwell Street. To the outside world, they explained that Heather had simply left home after an argument, a story that seemed plausible given her age and the family's reputation for dysfunction. The murder of Heather represented a new level of depravity for the Wests. This wasn't a stranger who had wandered into their web, this was their own flesh and blood, a child they had raised from birth. The fact that they could kill her so coldly demonstrated just how completely they had abandoned any trace of normal human emotion. For 7 years after Heather's murder, the Wests continued their charade of normalcy. Fred worked construction jobs around Gloucester, often being hired by respectable families who had no idea of his true nature. Rose managed the household and occasionally worked as a prostitute, a profession that provided both income and potential victims. The remaining West children grew up knowing that their sister hadn't simply run away, but they also understood the mortal danger of speaking about what they knew. The family's code of silence was enforced through violence and terror, creating a hermetically sealed world where truth could never surface. However, by the early 1990s, cracks were beginning to appear in the facade. Some of the older West children had left home and were beginning to process their experiences through the lens of normal society. They realized that their childhoods had been far from typical and that their parents' behavior was not just abusive but potentially criminal. In August 1992, the case took a dramatic turn when one of the West children made a disclosure to a friend about the sexual abuse they had suffered. This friend, understanding the seriousness of the allegations, contacted social services, who in turn involved the police. Initially, the investigation focused on the sexual abuse allegations. Fred was arrested and charged with multiple counts of rape and sexual assault against his children. Rose was arrested on similar charges. The children were taken into care, finally safe from their parents' violence after years of suffering. During interviews with social workers and police, the children began to reveal more disturbing information. They spoke about the lodgers who had disappeared, about strange sounds from the basement, about their parents' threats that misbehaving children would end up under the patio like Heather. Police acted on a tip from social services regarding a horrifying rumor they were told by the children of the couple. If they misbehaved, the children said, they'd end up under the patio like Heather. This casual reference to their missing sister being under the patio struck investigators as far more than typical family dark humor. Detective Superintendent John Bennett, who would lead the investigation, recognized that they were potentially dealing with something far more serious than sexual abuse. The children's casual references to buried bodies and their obvious terror when discussing certain topics suggested that 25 Cromwell Street might hold secrets that went beyond domestic violence. On February 24, 1994, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street with search warrants and excavation equipment. They were looking for Heather West, but they had no idea of the extent of the horrors they were about to uncover. The search began in the garden, where the children had indicated Heather might be buried. Within hours, the excavation team made their first grisly discovery: human remains that appeared to have been buried for several years. The bones showed signs of dismemberment and deliberate mutilation, suggesting that whoever had been buried there had suffered terribly before death. As the dig continued, more bodies were discovered. Each set of remains told a similar story of torture, sexual violence, and ultimate murder. The victims had been systematically dismembered, with certain bones showing evidence of having been removed while the victims were still alive. Fred West, initially defiant when arrested, began to realize that the physical evidence was overwhelming. In a series of interviews, he started to admit to some of the murders, though he consistently tried to minimize Rose's involvement. His confessions were detailed and chilling, delivered with a matter-of-fact tone that shocked even experienced investigators. The excavation expanded to include the basement and other areas of the house. Authorities would ultimately uncover parts of 12 bodies, 9 sets of which were recovered from the West's house on Cromwell Street, and 3 others found in other locations. Each discovery added another layer to the horror story that was unfolding in the quiet Gloucester neighborhood. Media attention intensified as the scale of the discoveries became apparent. 25 Cromwell Street became the center of international attention, with journalists and cameras documenting every aspect of the investigation. The house that had hidden its secrets for so long was now exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. As the evidence mounted, Fred West found himself in an impossible position. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but he was desperately trying to protect Rose from prosecution. In his twisted logic, he may have genuinely believed he was being chivalrous by taking responsibility for crimes they had committed together. Fred's confessions were detailed but strategically incomplete. He admitted to killing multiple victims, describing their torture and murder with disturbing clinical detachment. However, he consistently claimed that Rose had been unaware of his activities, painting himself as a lone wolf who had somehow concealed a decades-long killing spree from his live-in partner. The contradictions in Fred's story were obvious to investigators. How could Rose have lived in a house where multiple murders were committed without being aware of them? How could she have failed to notice the extensive excavation work required to bury bodies in the basement and garden? How could she have been oblivious to the screams that must have emanated from the basement during the torture sessions? Rose, meanwhile, maintained complete innocence. She claimed to have no knowledge of any murders and painted herself as another victim of Fred's manipulation and violence. Her defense strategy was to portray Fred as a controlling monster who had terrorized her into silence and compliance. However, survivors who had escaped the West household told a different story. Caroline Owens, who had worked as a nanny for the family in 1972, described being sexually assaulted by both Fred and Rose. She testified that Rose had been an active and enthusiastic participant in the attack, not a reluctant accomplice. Other witnesses came forward with similar accounts. The picture that emerged was of a partnership where both individuals were equally culpable, each contributing their own particular skills to the systematic torture and murder of vulnerable young women. On January 1, 1995, Fred West was found dead in his cell at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. He had hanged himself using bedsheets, leaving behind a note that maintained his claims about Rose's innocence. His suicide came just hours after he had been told that he would also be charged with the murder of his first wife, Rena, and his stepdaughter, Charmaine. Fred's death created both relief and frustration for investigators and victims' families. Relief because it ended his ability to manipulate and lie about the crimes, but frustration because it meant they would never get complete answers about all the murders and might struggle to prove Rose's involvement without his testimony. Rose's trial began in October 1995 at Winchester Crown Court. The prosecution built their case methodically, using physical evidence, witness testimony, and logical deduction to prove that she must have been an active participant in the murders. They argued that it was impossible for someone to live in such close proximity to serial killings without being aware of them, and that the evidence showed Rose had been present and participating in many of the crimes. The defense attempted to portray Rose as a victim of Fred's psychological manipulation, arguing that she had been too frightened and controlled to resist or report his activities. They painted Fred as a master manipulator who had terrorized Rose into compliance through violence and intimidation. However, the prosecution presented evidence of Rose's own violent tendencies, including her murder of Charmaine while Fred was in prison. They showed that Rose had been present during attacks on survivors, had participated actively in sexual assaults, and had shown no remorse or empathy for the victims. On November 22, 1995, after deliberating for more than 6 hours, the jury found Rose West guilty on all 10 counts of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment and will remain in prison until she dies. The judge recommended that she should never be released, making her one of the few women in British legal history to receive such a sentence. The demolition of 25 Cromwell Street in October 1996 marked the end of one chapter in the Fred and Rose West story, but many questions remained unanswered. The house was completely destroyed, its bricks crushed and scattered to prevent them from becoming macabre souvenirs, and the site was turned into a walkway. Investigators continued to explore whether the Wests might have been responsible for additional unsolved disappearances. Police excavations at a cafe in the quiet English city of Gloucester revived a half-century-old puzzle. What happened to Mary Bastholm, a carefree 15-year-old girl who went missing in January 1968? Mary had worked at a cafe that Fred West had frequented, and there were suggestions that she might have been his first victim. The West children, meanwhile, faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives after decades of abuse and trauma. Some chose to speak publicly about their experiences, hoping to help other abuse survivors, while others preferred to maintain their privacy and try to create normal lives away from the shadow of their parents' crimes. The case raised broader questions about how such extensive criminal activity could go undetected for so long. Social services, police, and the community had all had opportunities to intervene earlier, but a combination of social prejudices, institutional failures, and the West's manipulative skills had allowed them to continue their crimes for decades. The Fred and Rose West case remains one of the most disturbing criminal cases in British history, not just because of the number of victims or the brutality of the crimes, but because of what it revealed about the capacity for evil that can exist behind the facade of ordinary suburban life. Rose has always protested her innocence and has revealed nothing about the case over the years, maintaining her silence and showing no apparent remorse for the crimes. This continued denial has been particularly painful for the families of victims, who have never received acknowledgement of their loved one's suffering or any expression of regret for the devastation caused. The case has been studied extensively by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals trying to understand how such a partnership of evil could develop and persist. The dynamic between Fred and Rose West demonstrated how individual pathologies could combine to create something far more dangerous than either person might have been alone. For the city of Gloucester, the case created a lasting shadow that still affects the community today. The city has worked to move beyond its association with the murders, but the memory of 25 Cromwell Street continues to influence how people think about their community and their neighbors. The victims of Fred and Rose West were more than just statistics in a criminal case. They were daughters, sisters, friends, young women with hopes, dreams, and futures that were brutally cut short. Anna McFall was planning for her baby and a future with Fred. Lucy Partington was a brilliant student with a promising academic career ahead of her. Shirley Robinson believed she had found love and security with Fred. Each victim trusted the wrong people at the wrong time, and that trust cost them everything. Their stories serve as a reminder of the vulnerability that exists in human relationships and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of young women who are marginalized by society, runaways, those in care, sex workers, and others who exist on the fringes of mainstream society. The West specifically targeted these women because they understood that society was less likely to search vigorously for them or to believe their stories if they managed to escape. Today, more than 30 years after their crimes were discovered, Fred and Rose West remain symbols of the darkest aspects of human nature. Their story continues to fascinate and horrify in equal measure, serving as a reminder that evil can exist anywhere, hidden behind the most ordinary facades. The empty lot where 25 Cromwell Street once stood is now just another part of a walking path in Gloucester. Flowers are still occasionally left there by people who remember the victims, small memorial gestures in a place where remembering is both painful and necessary. Rose West remains in prison, having served more than 25 years of her life sentence. She is now in her 70s, an elderly woman who continues to maintain her innocence despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Prison staff report that she shows no remorse for her crimes and no empathy for the victims' families. The surviving West children have had to navigate lives shaped by unimaginable trauma. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences, becoming advocates for abuse survivors and working to prevent similar tragedies. Others have chosen privacy, trying to build normal lives away from the shadow of their parents' crimes. The case of Fred and Rose West serves as a stark reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can appear as ordinary neighbors, loving parents, or helpful community members. The signs of their true nature may be subtle, visible only to those who know what to look for or to those unfortunate enough to become their victims. Perhaps the most important lesson from this case is the need to listen to and believe vulnerable people when they report abuse or disappearances. Many of the West's victims had tried to reach out for help at various points, but their voices were dismissed or ignored by systems that should have protected them. The story of 25 Cromwell Street is ultimately a story about the failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. It's about the danger of looking away when something doesn't seem quite right, of making assumptions about people based on their social class or lifestyle, and of failing to take seriously the concerns of those who have the least power to make themselves heard. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the young women whose lives were cut short in that house of horrors. Remember that their stories matter, that they were more than just victims in a sensational crime case. They were human beings who deserved to live, to love, to grow old, and to be remembered for more than just the horrible way they died. In the end, perhaps the best way to honor their memory is to remain vigilant, to listen to those who cry out for help, and to never forget that evil can hide behind the most ordinary masks. The case of Fred and Rose West shows us that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who look just like everyone else. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The summer of 1976 was supposed to be like any other in the small farming town of Chowchilla, California. Nestled in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley, this close-knit community of just 5,000 souls lived by the rhythm of agricultural seasons. Children attended summer school, played in the warm afternoons, and looked forward to swimming at the local fairgrounds. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where doors remained unlocked, and where the most exciting news usually involved crop yields or high school football. But on July 15, 1976, Chowchilla would become the center of one of the most bizarre and terrifying kidnapping cases in American history. What began as an ordinary Thursday afternoon would transform into a nightmare that would grip the nation and forever change our understanding of childhood trauma. The day started unremarkably. 26 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, had spent their morning at Dairyland Elementary School's summer program. As the afternoon sun climbed higher in the California sky, they boarded school bus number 17 for what should have been a routine trip to the Madera County Fairgrounds for their weekly swimming outing. The children were a typical mix of elementary and middle school students. There was Jennifer Hyde, just 8 years old, sitting near the front with her younger sister. Larry Park, 14, one of the older boys who often helped keep the younger children in line. Monica Artery, whose infectious laugh could be heard throughout the bus. These weren't just statistics, they were real children with real families, carrying lunch money in their pockets and chlorine-scented towels from their swim. Behind the wheel sat Ed Ray, a beloved figure in the Chowchilla community. At 55 years old, Ed had been driving school buses for the district for years. He was known for his patience with children, his gentle manner, and his reliability. Parents trusted Ed Ray completely. He knew every child by name, understood their personalities, and treated each one as if they were his own grandchild. The swimming excursion went as planned. The children splashed and played in the pool, their voices echoing off the fairground buildings. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Ed Ray gathered his charges for the journey home. They climbed aboard the yellow bus, wet hair dripping, voices chattering about their day. It was approximately 4 p.m. when bus number 17 began its return journey along the quiet country roads that connected the fairgrounds to Chowchilla. The route was familiar, a straight stretch of Avenue 21, flanked by endless fields of crops that stretched toward the distant Sierra Nevada mountains. This was farming country, where miles could pass between houses, where the only sounds were the hum of the bus engine and the distant chirping of birds. But something was different this Thursday afternoon. As Ed Ray navigated the rural road, he noticed a white van parked across both lanes ahead, completely blocking their path. This was unusual but not necessarily alarming, perhaps another vehicle had broken down. Ed applied the brakes and brought the bus to a gentle stop, about 100 yards from the obstruction. As he sat there, wondering what to do next, 3 men emerged from the van. They were wearing nylon stockings pulled over their faces, distorting their features into grotesque masks. Each man carried a gun. The transformation from ordinary afternoon to living nightmare happened in seconds. The armed men approached the bus, their weapons visible through the windshield. Ed Ray, despite his shock and fear, tried to maintain calm. He opened the door when one of the gunmen demanded it, knowing that resistance might endanger the children behind him. "Everyone stay quiet," one of the masked men ordered as he boarded the bus. His voice was muffled by the stocking mask, but the authority in his tone was unmistakable. "We're not going to hurt anyone if you do exactly what we say." The children, who moments before had been laughing and chattering about their swim, fell silent. Some of the younger ones began to whimper. The older children instinctively tried to comfort their younger companions, whispering reassurances even as their own hearts pounded with terror. What happened next would be seared into the memories of every survivor. The gunman ordered everyone off the bus. 26 children and their bus driver were forced to walk to 2 waiting vans parked nearby, the white van that had blocked the road and a green one that had been hidden from view. The vehicles had been specifically prepared for this moment. The windows were painted black from the inside, and there were no door handles on the interior. These weren't random vehicles, they were custom-built prisons. The children were split into 2 groups. 13 children and Ed Ray were forced into one van, while the remaining 13 children were pushed into the other. The space was cramped, dark, and terrifying. Younger children were lifted and placed on the laps of older ones. The air was thick and stifling, made worse by the fear that permeated the enclosed space. As the van doors slammed shut, plunging them into darkness, Jennifer Hyde began to cry. She wasn't alone. Several of the younger children were sobbing, while the older ones tried to offer comfort they didn't feel themselves. Ed Ray's voice cut through the darkness, steady despite the circumstances. "Children," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd used for years on his bus routes, "we're going to be okay. We need to stay calm and take care of each other." But even Ed Ray, with all his experience and maturity, couldn't have imagined where they were being taken or what awaited them at their destination. The vans began to move, carrying their human cargo away from everything familiar. Through the metal walls, the children could hear the sounds of normal life continuing, cars passing, the distant hum of farm equipment, the everyday sounds of a world that had suddenly become unreachable. The journey lasted hours, though time became meaningless in the dark, confined space. The vans stopped occasionally, for gas, for food for the kidnappers, for reasons the captives couldn't fathom. During these stops, the children whispered to each other, sharing fears and trying to make sense of their situation. Some of the children recognized voices. Despite the stocking masks, certain inflections seemed familiar, though they couldn't quite place them. This detail would later prove crucial to investigators, but in the moment, it only added to the surreal nature of their ordeal. As the journey continued, the younger children began to have accidents. There was no bathroom, no relief from the cramped conditions. The older children did their best to help, sharing water when it was provided, offering comfort when they could. Ed Ray continued to talk to them, his voice a constant reminder that they weren't alone. "Tell me about your favorite part of swimming today," he would say, trying to distract them from their current reality. "Monica, what's your best stroke?" These small conversations became lifelines, moments of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. The vans eventually came to a stop. The children could hear voices outside, their captors talking among themselves. Car doors slammed, footsteps crunched on gravel, but the van doors remained closed. They were somewhere remote, that much was clear. There were no city sounds, no traffic, no signs of the civilized world they had been torn from. When the doors finally opened, it was dark outside. The children had lost track of time completely, but it was well into the evening. They were in what appeared to be an industrial area. They could make out the shapes of large equipment, piles of rock, and the stark silhouettes of machinery against the night sky. "Everyone out," commanded one of the masked men. "Stay together and don't try to run." The children stumbled from the vans, their legs cramped from hours of confinement. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they began to understand where they were. This was a quarry, an active rock quarry with deep pits carved into the earth and mountains of crushed stone rising like small mountains around them. In the center of this desolate landscape sat something that defied comprehension, a large moving van, the kind used by professional movers, but this one was partially buried in the ground with only its roof and back doors visible above the surface. "Down there," one of the gunmen ordered, gesturing toward the buried trailer with his weapon. What the children saw next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The back doors of the moving van were open, revealing not the expected cargo space, but something far more sinister. The trailer had been converted into an underground prison, complete with a ventilation system, water containers, and basic supplies. Wooden planks served as flooring over the van's metal surface, and batteries powered small fans to circulate air. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. The elaborate nature of the underground prison revealed months, perhaps a year of planning. Someone had purchased this moving van, transported it to this remote quarry, excavated a hole large enough to accommodate it, and carefully installed it as a subterranean chamber. The preparation was meticulous, calculated, and deeply disturbing. One by one, the children were forced down into the buried trailer. The opening was narrow, requiring them to climb down what was essentially a ladder made of wooden slats nailed to the van's interior wall. The younger children had to be helped by the older ones, with Ed Ray going first to assist them from below. Inside, the space was larger than the van's but still cramped for 27 people. The ceiling was low enough that the taller children and Ed Ray had to stoop. Mattresses were scattered on the floor, along with boxes of crackers, potato chips, and containers of water. A small battery-powered fan struggled to circulate the stale air. As the last child climbed down, one of the kidnappers appeared at the opening above. "There's food and water," he called down. "There's a place to go to the bathroom over there." He pointed to a crude arrangement in one corner. "Don't try anything stupid." Then came the moment that would define the next 16 hours of their lives. The kidnappers began sliding a heavy metal plate over the opening above them. The last sliver of night sky disappeared as the plate settled into place with a dull, metallic thud. Then they heard another sound, the scraping and grinding of dirt and rocks being shoveled on top of the metal cover. They were being buried alive. The realization hit different children at different moments. Some of the younger ones didn't fully understand what was happening. Others, particularly the teenagers, grasped the full horror of their situation immediately. They were 25 feet underground, sealed in a metal tomb, with no way to call for help and no guarantee that anyone would ever find them. Monica Artery began to hyperventilate. Several other children started crying. The sound echoed in the confined space, adding to the sense of claustrophobia and panic. But Ed Ray, despite his own terror, knew that panic would be their enemy. "Children," he said, his voice carrying across the buried trailer, "we need to stay calm. We need to think. And we need to work together." The first hours in the buried trailer tested every ounce of courage the children possessed. The darkness was complete once the battery-powered fans were turned off to conserve power. The silence was broken only by whispered conversations, quiet sobbing, and the occasional sound of movement as someone tried to find a more comfortable position on the thin mattresses. Ed Ray became their anchor in those terrifying hours. He moved through the darkness, checking on each child, offering comfort where he could, and trying to maintain some sense of order and hope. He rationed the water, distributed the limited food supplies, and established a system for using the primitive bathroom facilities that preserved as much dignity as possible in their degrading circumstances. The older children stepped up as well. Larry Park, at 14, appointed himself as Ed Ray's assistant, helping to calm the younger children and maintain discipline. Jennifer Hyde, despite being only 8, became a source of comfort for children even younger than herself. These acts of courage and selflessness would be remembered long after their rescue. As the hours passed, the air began to grow stale. The battery-powered fans weren't adequate for 27 people in such a confined space. Some of the children complained of headaches, while others found it difficult to breathe. The reality of their situation became increasingly clear: they weren't just imprisoned, they were slowly suffocating. It was during these darkest hours that conversations turned to escape. The older children and Ed Ray began to explore every inch of their prison, looking for weaknesses, for any possible way out. The walls were solid metal. The floor was wooden planks over more metal. The only potential exit was the opening above them, sealed by the heavy metal plate and covered with an unknown amount of dirt and rocks. "Mr. Ray," whispered one of the older boys, "do you think anyone knows we're missing yet?" Ed Ray considered the question carefully. "I'm sure they do," he said, though privately he wondered how long it would take for their absence to be noticed, and whether anyone would have any idea where to look for them. Meanwhile, above ground, their disappearance was indeed causing alarm. When the school bus failed to return from the fairgrounds that evening, worried parents began calling the school district. When they couldn't reach anyone there, they called the police. By late evening, search parties were forming, and by midnight, the FBI had been contacted. But down in their buried prison, the 27 captives knew nothing of the frantic search efforts above. They had no way of knowing that their empty bus had been found abandoned in a slough about 10 miles from where they'd been taken, or that law enforcement agencies across California were mobilizing to find them. What they did know was that they were running out of time. By the morning of July 16, nearly 16 hours after being sealed underground, the situation had become desperate. The air quality had deteriorated significantly, and several of the younger children were having difficulty breathing. The battery-powered fans had been turned off to conserve what little power remained, leaving them in complete darkness and stagnant air. It was then that Ed Ray made a decision that would save all their lives. He announced that they were going to dig their way out. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its uncertainty. They would stack the mattresses beneath the sealed opening, creating a platform tall enough for Ed Ray and the older boys to reach the metal plate above. Then they would try to move the plate and dig through whatever dirt and debris the kidnappers had placed on top. But first, they had to deal with the immediate crisis of air quality. Ed Ray organized the children into shifts, with some resting while others stayed active to keep from using too much oxygen. He rationed their remaining water and encouraged everyone to breathe slowly and deliberately. The escape attempt began with moving the mattresses. In the darkness, guided only by touch, Ed Ray and the older children stacked the thin mattresses as high as they could. The stack was unstable and swayed dangerously, but it was their only chance. Ed Ray climbed to the top of the improvised platform, his hands reaching up to touch the metal plate that sealed their tomb. The plate was heavy, far heavier than he had hoped. Worse, when he pushed against it, he could feel the weight of dirt and rocks piled on top. The kidnappers had done their work well. But Ed Ray didn't give up. With Larry Park and another older boy helping to steady the mattress stack from below, he began to push against the metal plate with all his strength. At first, nothing happened. The weight above seemed immovable. But gradually, fraction by fraction, the plate began to shift. "I can feel it moving," Ed Ray whispered down to the children below. Hope, which had been in short supply, began to kindle in the darkness. The work was exhausting. Ed Ray would push until his strength gave out, then one of the older boys would take his place. They took turns, spell by spell, gradually shifting the heavy metal plate. Each small movement allowed a little more dirt to fall through the opening, but it also let in something infinitely more precious: fresh air. The first breath of outside air that filtered down into their tomb was like a miracle. Children who had been lying listlessly on the floor began to sit up. The younger ones stopped crying. For the first time in nearly 18 hours, they had reason to hope. But the work was far from over. Moving the plate was only the beginning. Above it lay an unknown quantity of dirt, rocks, and debris that the kidnappers had used to hide the entrance. This material would have to be moved by hand, shovelful by shovelful, with no tools except their bare hands and a few small containers from their emergency supplies. Ed Ray squeezed through the partially opened gap and found himself in a narrow shaft leading to the surface. The walls were unstable, constantly threatening to collapse and rebury their escape route. Working in shifts, he and the older boys began the painstaking process of moving dirt and rocks, passing debris down to the children below, who carried it to the far end of the trailer. The work continued through the morning and into the afternoon of July 17th. Their hands were raw and bleeding from moving rocks and debris. Their clothes were filthy, and they were exhausted beyond description. But they kept working, driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on reaching the surface. Finally, after hours of digging, Ed Ray's hand broke through to sunlight. The opening was still small, barely large enough for a child to squeeze through, but it was a connection to the outside world, to freedom. One by one, the children were lifted up through the escape shaft. The youngest went first, helped by the older children and pulled to safety by Ed Ray from above. As each child emerged into the California sunshine, they experienced a rebirth, the transition from the tomb-like darkness below to the warm, bright world above. Jennifer Hyde, the 8-year-old who had cried so hard during their first hours of captivity, was among the first to reach the surface. Years later, she would remember that moment as the most beautiful sight of her life, not just the sun and sky, but the faces of her fellow survivors, dirty and exhausted but alive. Monica Artery, whose laugh had once filled the school bus, emerged blinking into the light, immediately asking if everyone had made it out safely. Larry Park, who had shown such maturity and courage during their ordeal, helped pull the last of the smaller children to freedom. When Ed Ray finally emerged from the buried trailer, 27 hours after their ordeal began, he looked around at the 26 children who had been placed in his care. They were all alive. They were all safe. They had done the impossible, they had escaped from their own grave. The rescue was only the beginning of a much larger story. As the 27 survivors made their way to a nearby road and flagged down help, law enforcement agencies that had been searching frantically for them suddenly had a crime scene, witnesses, and the beginning of what would become one of the most extensive investigations in FBI history. The children and Ed Ray were taken to local hospitals for medical evaluation. Miraculously, despite their ordeal, none had suffered serious physical injuries. The psychological trauma, however, would take much longer to assess and even longer to heal. Meanwhile, investigators descended on the rock quarry where the buried trailer had served as their prison. What they found there provided crucial clues to the kidnappers' identities. The trailer itself had been purchased months earlier. The quarry belonged to a specific company. The sophisticated nature of the underground prison suggested significant resources and planning. Most importantly, some of the children had recognized voices and mannerisms, despite the kidnappers stocking masks. These details, combined with physical evidence at the scene, began to paint a picture of who might be responsible for this elaborate crime. The investigation moved quickly. Within days, 3 suspects had been identified: Frederick Newhall Woods IV, a 24-year-old from a prominent California family, and brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld, aged 24 and 22 respectively, sons of a well-known doctor. These weren't desperate criminals from society's margins, they were young men from wealthy, established families who had apparently committed this crime for reasons that initially baffled investigators. The motive, when it emerged, was both simple and shocking. The 3 men had planned to demand a $5 million ransom for the safe return of the children and their bus driver. It was a crime motivated entirely by greed, with no political or ideological component. They had simply decided that kidnapping a school bus full of children was an acceptable way to get rich. But their plan had fatal flaws. The phone lines to the Chowchilla Police Department were jammed with calls from worried families and media outlets, making it impossible for the kidnappers to make their ransom demand. By the time they tried to call, the victims had already escaped, and their faces were being broadcast on television news across the country. The arrests came swiftly. Richard Schoenfeld surrendered to authorities in Alameda County. James Schoenfeld was arrested near the family home in Atherton after a failed attempt to flee to Canada. Frederick Woods, identified as the mastermind of the operation, was captured after a brief manhunt. The legal proceedings that followed would stretch on for years, involving multiple trials, appeals, and parole hearings. All three men were eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, though these sentences would later be modified to allow for parole consideration. For the 26 children and Ed Ray who survived the Chowchilla kidnapping, the escape from their underground prison marked the beginning of a different kind of journey, the long, difficult process of psychological healing. In 1976, the understanding of childhood trauma was limited compared to what we know today. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be officially recognized as a diagnosis until 1980. The concept of providing immediate psychological support to trauma victims was not yet standard practice. The children were examined for physical injuries, given clean clothes, reunited with their families, and expected to resume their normal lives. But normal life proved elusive for many of the survivors. In the days and weeks following their rescue, parents began to notice changes in their children's behavior. Some had nightmares. Others developed fears of enclosed spaces or situations where they felt trapped. Several showed signs of anxiety and depression that persisted long after the physical evidence of their ordeal had healed. Jennifer Hyde, the 8-year-old who had been among the youngest victims, struggled with claustrophobia for years. Simple activities like getting into elevators or sitting in the back seat of a car could trigger panic attacks. Her parents, like many others, sought help from therapists and counselors, but resources specifically designed for childhood trauma were limited. Monica Artery, whose laugh had once been infectious, found that laughter didn't come as easily anymore. She became withdrawn and had difficulty concentrating in school. The carefree childhood that had been interrupted by 27 hours of terror couldn't simply be resumed as if nothing had happened. The older children faced different challenges. Larry Park, who had shown such leadership during the crisis, felt a crushing sense of responsibility for what had happened to the younger children. Despite being a victim himself, he blamed himself for not being able to prevent the kidnapping or do more to help during their imprisonment. Ed Ray, the beloved bus driver who had shepherded all 26 children to safety, became something of a local hero. The community praised his courage and leadership during the crisis, and he was honored with awards and recognition. But like the children, he too struggled with the psychological aftermath of their shared ordeal. Years later, as our understanding of trauma improved, many of the Chowchilla survivors would participate in groundbreaking research into childhood PTSD. Their experiences helped mental health professionals better understand how children process and cope with extreme trauma, leading to improved treatment methods for future victims. Dr. Lenore Tur, a child psychiatrist, conducted extensive follow-up studies with the Chowchilla survivors over several decades. Her research revealed that even children who seemed to recover quickly from the immediate effects of the trauma often carried invisible scars for years. Some developed phobias, others had difficulty with trust and relationships, and many struggled with a persistent sense of vulnerability that colored their view of the world. But the research also revealed remarkable resilience. Despite their trauma, most of the Chowchilla survivors grew up to lead productive, meaningful lives. They became teachers, parents, business owners, and community leaders. Their shared experience created bonds between them that lasted decades, and many maintained contact with Ed Ray and with each other throughout their lives. The kidnapping and its aftermath also brought about changes in how schools and law enforcement agencies prepare for and respond to crisis situations involving children. Emergency protocols were developed, training programs were instituted, and resources for trauma counseling were expanded. As the investigation into the Chowchilla kidnapping deepened, the backgrounds of the three perpetrators revealed a troubling picture of privilege, entitlement, and moral bankruptcy that shocked the community and the nation. Frederick Newhall Woods IV came from a family whose wealth and prominence in California dated back to the gold rush era. The Woods family owned extensive real estate holdings, including the very quarry where the children had been imprisoned. Frederick had grown up surrounded by luxury, attending elite private schools and enjoying opportunities that most people could only dream of. Yet despite his advantages, Frederick Woods had always been something of an underachiever. He had dropped out of college, shown little interest in legitimate business ventures, and seemed to drift through life without purpose or direction. Friends and family members would later describe him as someone who expected success to come easily, without the hard work and dedication that achievement typically requires. The Schoenfeld brothers came from a similarly privileged background. Their father was a successful doctor, well respected in their affluent Atherton community. Like Woods, they had attended excellent schools and had every opportunity for success. Yet both brothers had also struggled to find their place in the world, showing patterns of irresponsibility and poor decision-making that concerned their family. What led these three young men from such advantaged backgrounds to commit such a heinous crime? The investigation revealed that they had met while attending Woodside High School and had remained friends afterward. In the months leading up to the kidnapping, they had discussed various get-rich-quick schemes, apparently viewing legitimate work as beneath them. The idea of kidnapping a school bus full of children for ransom appeared to have developed gradually. They spent nearly a year planning the crime, purchasing the moving van, preparing the buried prison, and working out the logistics of their scheme. The level of preparation was extraordinary, involving multiple trips to scout locations, careful timing to coordinate with the school calendar, and detailed planning for everything from food and water supplies to ventilation systems. What made their crime particularly chilling was its cold calculation. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a business plan, developed by young men who had decided that the lives and safety of innocent children were acceptable risks in their pursuit of easy money. The psychological profiles developed during their trials painted a picture of individuals with narcissistic tendencies and an alarming lack of empathy. They seemed genuinely surprised by the public outrage their crime generated, apparently believing that their plan was clever rather than monstrous. During their trials, all three showed little genuine remorse for the trauma they had inflicted on their victims. They seemed more concerned with the legal consequences they faced than with the suffering they had caused. This absence of empathy extended to their interactions with law enforcement, their attorneys, and even their own families. The contrast between the perpetrators and their victims was stark. While 26 children and their bus driver had shown remarkable courage, resourcefulness, and mutual care during their ordeal, the three kidnappers had demonstrated cowardice, selfishness, and a callous disregard for human welfare. The legal proceedings following the Chowchilla kidnapping stretched across decades, raising complex questions about justice, punishment, and the possibility of redemption for those who commit terrible crimes. Initially, all three men were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Effectively, they were condemned to die in prison for their crimes. The sentences reflected the severity of their actions and the public's outrage over what they had done. For many years, it seemed that justice had been served and that the perpetrators would never again pose a threat to society. However, the legal system is complex, and sentences that seem final often prove to be subject to change through appeals, legal challenges, and evolving standards of justice. Over the years, the three kidnappers' cases worked their way through various appeals courts, with their attorneys arguing that life sentences without parole were excessive for a crime where no one had been killed. In 1981, their sentences were modified to allow for the possibility of parole, though they would still serve many years in prison before becoming eligible for consideration. This change was controversial, particularly among the survivors and their families, who felt that the kidnappers' sentences were already inadequate given the magnitude of their crimes. The parole hearings, when they began, became emotional affairs that reopened old wounds for the survivors and their families. Many of the former child victims, now adults, attended these hearings to argue against their kidnappers' release. They spoke eloquently about the lasting impact of the crime on their lives and their concerns about the dangers of releasing the perpetrators. Richard Schoenfeld was the first to be granted parole, in 2012, after serving 36 years in prison. His release was controversial but legally sound. He had served his minimum sentence, had maintained a clean record while incarcerated, and had participated in various rehabilitation programs. James Schoenfeld was paroled in 2015, also after 36 years of imprisonment. Like his brother, he had demonstrated good behavior during his incarceration and had expressed remorse for his actions, though many survivors questioned the sincerity of his contrition. Frederick Woods, identified as the mastermind of the kidnapping, remained in prison longer than his co-conspirators. His parole was denied multiple times, with parole boards citing concerns about his continued danger to society and questions about his genuine remorse. However, in 2022, after 46 years in prison, he too was granted parole. The releases of the three kidnappers sparked ongoing debates about the purpose of imprisonment, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the rights of victims to have their voices heard in the criminal justice process. Some argued that after decades in prison, the men had paid their debt to society and deserved a chance to live their remaining years in freedom. Others contended that the nature of their crimes was so heinous that they forfeited their right to freedom regardless of how much time had passed. For many of the survivors, the parole decisions represented a failure of the justice system to protect them and to acknowledge the lasting impact of the crimes committed against them. They had been children when they were victimized, and they felt victimized again by a legal system that seemed to prioritize the rights of criminals over the concerns of their victims. Nearly 50 years after the Chowchilla kidnapping, the case continues to resonate in American culture and criminal justice. It remains one of the most studied kidnapping cases in history, not only because of its bizarre nature and dramatic escape, but because of what it revealed about human resilience, the long-term effects of trauma, and the complexities of justice. The immediate legacy of Chowchilla was a transformation in how schools and law enforcement agencies approach crisis situations involving children. Emergency protocols were developed and refined, training programs were instituted for school personnel, and communication systems were improved to ensure a rapid response to reports of missing children. The case also contributed significantly to our understanding of childhood trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. The long-term studies conducted with the Chowchilla survivors provided crucial insights into how children process and cope with extreme trauma, leading to improved treatment methods and support systems for future victims. Perhaps most importantly, the Chowchilla case highlighted the extraordinary capacity for courage and resilience that exists within ordinary people, including children, when faced with extreme circumstances. Ed Ray's leadership during the crisis, the older children's care for their younger companions, and the collective determination that led to their escape became an inspiring example of human strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. The survivors themselves became advocates for various causes related to child safety, trauma treatment, and victims' rights. Their willingness to share their experiences, painful as it often was, helped countless other trauma survivors understand that healing was possible and that they were not alone in their struggles. The case also raised important questions about privilege, entitlement, and moral responsibility that remain relevant today. The fact that the perpetrators came from wealthy, educated backgrounds challenged assumptions about who commits serious crimes and why. Their sense of entitlement to easy wealth, their lack of empathy for their victims, and their apparent belief that their privileged status would protect them from consequences reflected broader social issues that extend far beyond this single case. In the end, the Chowchilla kidnapping stands as both a testament to human resilience and a sobering reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist even in those who have been given every advantage in life. It reminds us that courage can be found in the most unlikely places, including in children who find themselves buried alive in a remote quarry, and that the human spirit's capacity to survive and overcome even the most terrible circumstances should never be underestimated. The yellow school bus that was supposed to safely carry 26 children home from their summer swimming trip became instead the starting point for one of the most harrowing ordeals in criminal history. But it also became the beginning of a story of survival, courage, and ultimate triumph that continues to inspire people around the world. As we remember the events of July 15 and 16, 1976, we honor not just the survivors of Chowchilla, but all those who have faced unimaginable challenges and found within themselves the strength to endure, to escape, and ultimately, to heal. Their story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope remains possible, and that sometimes, the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary acts of courage. The children who disappeared into the earth that summer afternoon in 1976 emerged not just as survivors, but as symbols of the indomitable human spirit. Their legacy lives on in improved child protection measures, better understanding of trauma, and most importantly, in the knowledge that even when buried alive, the human capacity for hope and determination can still find a way to reach the surface and breathe free air once again. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet river town of Council Bluffs, Iowa, where the Missouri River separates Nebraska from Iowa, winter arrives with a particular stillness that seems to muffle even the busiest streets. It was during one such winter in February 2023 that a story unfolded that would shake this close-knit community to its core. This is the story of Eileen Gowan, a beloved waitress whose disappearance would reveal dark truths about love, betrayal, and the length some will go to cover their crimes. Eileen Gowan was 60 years old in the winter of 2023, a woman who had lived a full life marked by both joy and hardship. Those who knew her described her as someone whose laughter could fill a room, a woman who had an innate ability to make others feel welcomed and heard. She worked as a waitress at a local bar in Council Bluffs, a job that suited her naturally outgoing personality and her genuine care for others. Eileen was a mother, and her son Jack Kilgore would later speak of her warmth and the way she brought light into every room she entered. Like many people her age, Eileen's life had been shaped by decades of experiences, relationships that had come and gone, dreams that had been pursued and sometimes set aside. She was at a stage in life where each day carried a certain weight, a recognition of time's passage that made moments of connection all the more precious. But Eileen's life in Council Bluffs was not without complications. She found herself entangled in an on-again, off-again relationship that would ultimately prove to be her undoing. The man in question was Ivan Samuel Brammer, known to friends as Sam, a 61-year-old man whose presence in Eileen's life brought with it an undercurrent of instability and danger that perhaps Eileen herself didn't fully recognize. Relationships in later life often carry a different set of expectations and compromises than those of youth. For Eileen and Ivan Brammer, their connection was marked by the kind of turbulence that suggests deep-seated issues lying beneath the surface. Friends and family would later describe their relationship as volatile, one that seemed to cycle through periods of separation and reconciliation with troubling regularity. Ivan Brammer was not an unknown figure in Council Bluffs. At 61, he had his own history in the community, his own patterns of behavior that those close to him had observed over the years. What emerged during the investigation would paint a picture of a man whose reactions to stress and conflict followed disturbing patterns that would prove deadly when combined with the intimate dynamics of a romantic relationship. The nature of their relationship troubles isn't entirely clear from the records, but what is evident is that by early 2023, Eileen and Ivan were once again in one of their off periods. Eileen had moved out and was staying with a friend, a decision that suggested she was trying to create some distance from whatever difficulties had arisen between them. This period of separation would prove to be a crucial element in understanding what happened next. February 2023 in Council Bluffs was marked by the kind of bitter cold that characterizes Midwestern winters. The Missouri River, which forms the natural boundary between Iowa and Nebraska, would have been partially frozen, creating a stark landscape of ice and snow that seemed to stretch endlessly under gray winter skies. It was during this cold February that the final chapter of Eileen Gowan's life began to unfold. On February 13, 2023, Eileen was last seen alive. She had been staying with a friend during her separation from Ivan, trying to rebuild her life away from the turbulent relationship that had consumed so much of her recent years. But on this particular day, she encountered Ivan Brammer, and this meeting would be their last. The exact circumstances of their final encounter remain known only to Ivan Brammer himself, but what investigators would later piece together suggests a meeting that quickly turned deadly. Perhaps they had arranged to discuss their relationship, or maybe the encounter was chance. What is certain is that by the end of February 13, Eileen Gowan was dead, though it would be days before anyone realized she was missing. February 15, 2023, marked a significant date in the investigation that would follow. It was on this day that Ivan Brammer made a deposit of $1,500 into his bank account, money that investigators would later determine had belonged to Eileen. It was also around this time that concerned friends and family members began to realize that Eileen had seemingly vanished without a trace. When someone goes missing in a small community like Council Bluffs, word travels quickly through the networks of friends, family, and co-workers who make up the fabric of daily life. Eileen's absence from her usual haunts was noted first by those who knew her routines, the regular customers at the bar where she worked, the friends who expected to hear from her regularly. On February 15, 2023, Eileen Gowan was officially reported missing to the Council Bluffs Police Department. The report triggered the standard procedures for a missing person case, but from the beginning, there were elements that suggested this was not a typical disappearance. Eileen was described as someone who maintained regular contact with her family and friends, making her sudden silence particularly alarming. The investigation began with interviews of those closest to Eileen, including her son Jack Kilgore and the friends with whom she had been staying. Inevitably, investigators' attention turned to Ivan Brammer, given his recent relationship with Eileen and the fact that he was among the last people known to have seen her. As police began their inquiry, they discovered several troubling details about Ivan Brammer's behavior in the days following Eileen's disappearance. Witnesses reported seeing Eileen in Brammer's truck shortly before she vanished, but her appearance in the passenger seat was described as unusual. According to these accounts, she appeared to be slumped over in an unnatural position, a detail that would prove significant as the investigation progressed. Even more suspicious was Brammer's decision to get rid of his truck just days after Eileen's disappearance. This action, combined with the witness accounts of Eileen's unusual position in the vehicle, created a pattern of behavior that investigators found deeply concerning. Winter in Iowa can be brutally long, with February often representing the deepest, coldest part of the season. Snow covers the landscape in a blanket that can hide many things, creating a deceptive quiet that masks the realities lying beneath. It was in this frozen landscape, on February 26, 2023, that the truth about Eileen Gowan's fate finally came to light. The discovery was made in a roadside ditch near the intersection of 152nd Street and Old Mormon Bridge Road, close to the small community of Crescent, Iowa, just outside Council Bluffs. The Old Mormon Bridge area is historically significant, named for the bridge that once carried Mormon pioneers across the Missouri River in the mid-1800s. Now, this quiet rural area would become the site of a tragic discovery that would haunt the community. Eileen Gowan's body was found frozen in the ditch, a victim not only of violence but also of the bitter February weather that had preserved her remains in the days since her death. The location was rural and isolated, the kind of place someone might choose if they were trying to dispose of evidence and hoping it would remain hidden. The Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction over the area where the body was found, began processing what was clearly now a crime scene. The condition of Eileen's remains told a story of violence, with multiple abrasions and lacerations visible on her body. But determining the exact cause of death would prove more challenging than investigators initially anticipated. When a body is found in the condition that Eileen Gowan's was, determining the cause of death can be complicated by numerous factors. The winter weather, the time that had passed since her death, and the condition of the remains all contributed to making the medical examiner's job particularly difficult. The initial examination revealed the multiple injuries to Eileen's body, but the medical examiner was unable to definitively determine what had caused her death. This created a significant obstacle for investigators who suspected Ivan Brammer but needed concrete evidence to support murder charges. Without a clear cause of death, the case against Brammer remained incomplete. However, there was enough evidence to charge Brammer with other crimes related to Eileen's death. He was arrested and charged with abuse of a corpse, reflecting the evidence that he had disposed of her body in the roadside ditch. Additionally, he faced charges of second-degree theft, related to the $1,500 that had appeared in his bank account shortly after Eileen's disappearance, money that investigators believed belonged to her. These charges were serious, but they fell short of the murder charge that Eileen's family and the investigators believed was warranted. The case seemed to be at an impasse, with Ivan Brammer potentially avoiding the most serious consequences for what appeared to be a brutal crime. For Jack Kilgore and the rest of Eileen Gowan's family, the inability to charge Ivan Brammer with murder was devastating. They had lost a beloved mother, sister, and friend, and the man they believed responsible might escape the full consequences of his actions. The family's pain was compounded by their frustration with the limitations of the legal system when faced with cases where the evidence is not immediately clear-cut. But the Gowan family was not prepared to accept this outcome. In their desperate search for justice, they made a decision that would ultimately prove to be the key to solving the case. They reached out to Dr. Michael Baden, one of the most famous forensic pathologists in the United States, hoping that his expertise might reveal what the initial examination had missed. Dr. Baden's reputation in the field of forensic pathology is legendary. He has worked on some of the most high-profile cases in American criminal justice, including the investigations into the deaths of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. His expertise in determining cause of death in challenging cases made him the perfect choice for the Gowan family's desperate plea for justice. The decision to bring in Dr. Baden represented a significant expense and risk for the family. There was no guarantee that his examination would reveal anything new, and if it didn't, they would have exhausted one of their last hopes for justice. But their love for Eileen and their determination to see her killer held accountable drove them to take this chance. When Dr. Baden agreed to examine Eileen Gowan's remains, he brought with him decades of experience in cases where the cause of death was not immediately apparent. His examination was thorough and methodical, looking not just at the obvious injuries but also at the subtle signs that might tell the story of Eileen's final moments. What Dr. Baden discovered would prove to be the breakthrough that the case desperately needed. During his detailed examination, he found evidence that had been missed in the initial autopsy, a zipper imprint on Eileen's neck. This seemingly small detail would prove to be enormously significant in understanding how Eileen had died. The zipper imprint suggested that Eileen had been strangled, but not with hands or a rope. Instead, the evidence pointed to strangulation with a piece of clothing that had a zipper, most likely a jacket or sweatshirt. This discovery provided the crucial missing piece of the puzzle that investigators needed to understand exactly how Eileen had died. But Dr. Baden's examination revealed even more compelling evidence. When he examined Ivan Brammer's hands, he found matching zipper impressions that corresponded to the marks found on Eileen's neck. This evidence created a direct physical link between Brammer and the method of Eileen's murder, providing the concrete proof that had been missing from the case. The discovery of the zipper imprints was more than just forensic evidence, it was a window into the violent struggle that had taken place during Eileen's final moments. The pattern of the marks told a story of prolonged pressure and struggle, suggesting that Eileen had fought for her life before succumbing to the attack. Armed with Dr. Baden's findings, prosecutors finally had the evidence they needed to charge Ivan Brammer with murder. The zipper imprints provided clear proof of both the method of death and Brammer's direct involvement in the crime. On August 9, 2023, months after Eileen's body had been discovered, Ivan Samuel Brammer was formally charged with second-degree murder. The murder charge represented a crucial victory for Eileen's family and for the cause of justice. It meant that Brammer would face the full consequences of his actions, rather than the lesser charges that had initially been filed. For Jack Kilgore and the rest of the family, it was a moment of relief tempered by the ongoing grief of their loss. The timeline of events that led to the murder charge revealed the complexity of modern forensic investigation. From Eileen's disappearance on February 13 to the discovery of her body on February 26, to the initial charges in May and finally the murder charge in August, the case had taken months to develop. Each step had required careful investigation and analysis, culminating in the breakthrough provided by Dr. Boden's expertise. The charging document painted a picture of premeditation and deliberate action. The evidence suggested that Brammer had not only killed Eileen but had then taken steps to conceal his crime by disposing of her body in the remote ditch and getting rid of his truck, which presumably contained evidence of the crime. With the murder charge filed, investigators were able to build a more complete picture of what had happened between Eileen Gowan and Ivan Brammer. The $1,500 that Brammer had deposited into his bank account on February 15 became a key piece of evidence, suggesting that robbery may have been a motive in addition to whatever personal conflicts existed between them. The investigation revealed that Brammer's behavior following Eileen's disappearance had been consistent with someone trying to cover up a crime. In addition to disposing of his truck, witnesses reported that he had acted nervously and had given conflicting accounts of his last contact with Eileen. These behavioral patterns, combined with the physical evidence, created a compelling case against him. Investigators also examined the location where Eileen's body was found. The choice of the remote ditch near Old Mormon Bridge Road suggested local knowledge and a deliberate attempt to hide the body in a place where it might not be discovered for a long time. The fact that it was found relatively quickly was more due to chance than to any failure in Brammer's plan. The case also highlighted the importance of forensic science in modern criminal investigation. Without Dr. Boden's expertise in identifying the zipper imprints, Brammer might have escaped a murder charge entirely. This aspect of the case demonstrated how advances in forensic pathology continue to provide new tools for investigators dealing with challenging cases. The trial of Ivan Samuel Brammer began in the fall of 2023, bringing together all the evidence that had been gathered over the months following Eileen's death. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Dr. Boden's forensic findings, particularly the zipper imprints that provided direct evidence of how Eileen had been killed and who had killed her. Dr. Baden himself testified at the trial, explaining to the jury his findings and the significance of the zipper imprints. His testimony was crucial in helping the jury understand not just what had happened to Eileen, but how the physical evidence pointed directly to Brammer as her killer. The defense faced the challenging task of explaining away not just the forensic evidence but also Brammer's suspicious behavior following Eileen's disappearance. The disposal of his truck, the conflicting stories he told to investigators, and the $1,500 that appeared in his bank account all painted a picture of someone with something to hide. Throughout the trial, the human impact of the crime remained central to the proceedings. Jack Kilgore and other family members testified about Eileen as a person, not just as a victim. They spoke of her laughter, her kindness, and the hole her death had left in their lives. Their testimony reminded the jury that behind all the forensic evidence and legal arguments was a real person whose life had been violently cut short. On November 15, 2023, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all charges. Ivan Samuel Brammer was convicted of second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and second-degree theft. The conviction represented a complete victory for the prosecution and brought a measure of justice for Eileen's family. The sentencing hearing in January 2024 provided an opportunity for Eileen's family to confront her killer directly. Jack Kilgore and other family members spoke about the impact of Eileen's death on their lives, describing the grief and anger they had carried since her disappearance. Their statements painted a picture of a family shattered by loss but determined to see justice done. The judge sentenced Ivan Brammer to a maximum of 50 years for the murder charge, with additional sentences for the other charges to be served concurrently. At 61 years old, this sentence effectively meant that Brammer would spend the rest of his life in prison for his crimes. During the sentencing, the judge noted the particularly cruel nature of the crimes, referencing not just the murder itself but also the disposal of Eileen's body and the theft of her money. The sentence reflected the court's view that Brammer's actions represented a complete disregard for human life and dignity. For Eileen's family, the sentencing brought a sense of closure, though nothing could bring back the woman they had lost. Jack Kilgore spoke of his relief that his mother's killer would never be free to harm anyone else, and his gratitude for the work of Dr. Baden and the investigators who had made the conviction possible. Today, near the spot where Eileen Gowan's body was found, there stands a memorial that serves as a reminder of her life and the tragedy of her death. The location beneath the old Mormon Bridge Road overpass, once a place of historical significance for westward traveling pioneers, has become a place of remembrance for a woman whose journey was cut short by violence. Jack Kilgore and other family members continue to visit the memorial, finding some comfort in having a place where they can remember Eileen and reflect on her life. The memorial serves not just as a marker of tragedy but as a celebration of the person Eileen was, the woman whose laughter could fill a room, whose kindness touched everyone she met. The case of Eileen Gowan's murder has also become part of the broader conversation about domestic violence and the dangers that women face, particularly in later life when the dynamics of relationships can become more complex and the support systems may be less robust. Her story serves as a reminder that violence can occur in any relationship, at any age, and that recognizing the warning signs is crucial for prevention. The memorial also stands as a testament to the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of justice. Without the determination of Eileen's family to seek additional expertise, Ivan Brammer might have escaped the full consequences of his actions. Their persistence in seeking the truth, even when the initial investigation seemed to have reached a dead end, ultimately made the difference between justice and injustice. The murder of Eileen Gowan represents more than just another true crime story. It's a complex tale of relationships, violence, and the sometimes challenging path to justice. The case highlights how modern forensic science can provide answers even when initial investigations fall short, and how the determination of families seeking justice can make the crucial difference in complex cases. The role of Dr. Michael Baden in solving the case cannot be overstated. His expertise in forensic pathology provided the breakthrough that transformed a case with insufficient evidence for murder charges into one with compelling proof of guilt. The discovery of the zipper imprint serves as an example of how attention to detail and expertise can reveal truths that might otherwise remain hidden. For the community of Council Bluffs, the case served as a stark reminder that violence can occur anywhere, even in small towns where people think they know their neighbors. The revelation that someone they knew was capable of such brutality was shocking, but it also brought the community together in support of Eileen's family during their time of grief. The case also raises questions about the nature of relationships and the warning signs that might indicate potential for violence. The on-again, off-again nature of Eileen and Ivan's relationship, while not uncommon, may have created conditions that contributed to the tragedy. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for helping others recognize when they might be in danger. The story of Eileen Gowan's murder has resonated beyond Council Bluffs, appearing in various true crime media and serving as a case study in the importance of advanced forensic investigation. The case has been featured on television programs dedicated to true crime, where experts have analyzed the investigative techniques that led to Brammer's conviction. Dr. Baden's involvement in the case has also highlighted the continuing evolution of forensic pathology and its role in the criminal justice system. His ability to identify evidence that had been missed in the initial examination demonstrates the value of seeking additional expertise when cases seem to have reached an impasse. For law enforcement agencies, the case serves as an example of the importance of persistence and thoroughness in investigation. The initial charges against Brammer, while significant, were not sufficient to address the full scope of his crimes. The additional investigation that led to the murder charges shows how continuing to pursue leads and evidence can ultimately lead to justice. The case has also contributed to discussions about the resources available to families seeking justice for their loved ones. The Gowan family's ability to hire Dr. Baden was crucial to the case's resolution, but it also raises questions about whether similar resources should be more readily available to all families, regardless of their financial circumstances. Beneath all the legal proceedings, forensic evidence, and criminal justice procedures lies a simpler story of love and loss. Eileen Gowan was a mother, a friend, a co-worker who brought joy to those around her. Her death represents not just the loss of one life, but the loss of all the moments, laughter, and love she would have continued to share with those who knew her. Jack Kilgore's dedication to seeking justice for his mother demonstrates the profound bond between parent and child, a bond that death cannot sever. His determination to ensure that Ivan Brammer faced the full consequences of his actions was driven not by vengeance but by love and a desire to honor his mother's memory. The friends and co-workers who mourned Eileen's passing remember her as someone who made their lives brighter simply by being present. These memories serve as a counterpoint to the darkness of her death, reminding us that even in the face of terrible tragedy, the good that people do in their lives continues to matter. The story also reflects the broader human capacity for both great evil and great good. While Ivan Brammer's actions represent a terrible betrayal of trust and humanity, the response of Eileen's family, the dedication of investigators, and the expertise of professionals like Dr. Baden demonstrate the ways in which people can come together to seek truth and justice. As winter settles again over Council Bluffs, Iowa, the Missouri River flows quietly past the town where Eileen Gowan lived and worked. The seasons continue their eternal cycle, but the impact of her life and the circumstances of her death remain part of the community's memory. The memorial that stands near where her body was found serves as a permanent reminder of both a life lost and justice achieved. Visitors to the site might pause to reflect on the fragility of life and the importance of treating one another with kindness and respect. The case of Eileen Gowan's murder ultimately became a story of justice prevailing, but only through the determined efforts of family members who refused to accept an incomplete investigation. Their persistence, combined with the expertise of forensic professionals and the dedication of law enforcement, ensured that Ivan Brammer would face the full consequences of his actions. For those who knew Eileen, justice cannot bring her back, but it can provide some measure of peace in knowing that her killer will never be free to harm another person. The laughter that once filled the rooms where she worked may have been silenced, but the memory of her warmth and kindness continues to live on in the hearts of those who loved her. In the quiet moments of a winter evening in Council Bluffs, when the snow falls softly and the world seems muffled in peaceful silence, it's possible to remember Eileen Gowan not as a victim of violence but as a person who brought light to others during her time on Earth. That, perhaps, is the most fitting memorial of all. The story of Eileen Gowan reminds us that behind every true crime case is a real person with a real life, real relationships, and real people who mourn their passing. While we may be fascinated by the details of criminal investigation and the pursuit of justice, we must never forget that at the heart of these stories are human beings whose lives had meaning far beyond the circumstances of their death. As the winter wind blows across the plains of Iowa, carrying with it the memories of those who are gone, we can take comfort in knowing that love endures beyond death, that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail, and that the determination of those who seek truth in the face of darkness can light the way for others who follow. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we're examining a case that shook the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico to its core. This is the story of 10-year-old Victoria Martins, and the long quest for justice that followed her tragic death in August 2016. As always, we approach these stories with respect for the victims and their families. This case contains difficult subject matter, but will focus on the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the pursuit of justice that continues to this day. It was August 24, 2016, and the late summer heat was settling over Albuquerque's west side like a heavy blanket. The apartment complex on Arroyo Vino Road appeared ordinary enough from the outside, a typical multi-story building that housed working families, retirees, and young couples starting their lives together. But inside apartment number 808, something terrible had occurred just hours before. The Albuquerque Police Department received a 911 call that morning reporting a domestic disturbance. It seemed routine at first, the kind of call that officers respond to dozens of times each day. Domestic disputes, loud arguments between neighbors, maybe a couple having a particularly heated disagreement that had gotten out of hand. Officer Daniel Delatorre was among the first to arrive at the scene. He had been with the department for several years and had seen his share of difficult situations. Nothing, however, could have prepared him for what he would discover inside that apartment. When the door opened, the officers were immediately struck by an unusual smell, something acrid and disturbing that seemed to permeate the entire space. The apartment itself appeared relatively normal at first glance. There was furniture arranged in typical fashion, a television, some personal belongings scattered about. But there was also something unsettling in the air, a sense that something was deeply wrong. Michelle Martins, a 35-year-old woman with shoulder-length dark hair, answered the door. She seemed nervous, fidgety, her eyes darting around as she spoke with the officers. She claimed everything was fine, that there had been no disturbance, no argument. But her demeanor suggested otherwise, and the officers' training told them to look deeper. As they began to examine the apartment more carefully, the smell became stronger. It led them toward the bathroom, and what they found there would haunt them for the rest of their careers. In the bathtub, partially wrapped in a blanket and burned beyond recognition in some areas, were the dismembered remains of a child. The horror of the scene was immediate and overwhelming. This was not a case of domestic violence gone wrong, not an argument between adults that had escalated. This was something far more sinister, something that would require the full resources of the Albuquerque Police Department and the District Attorney's Office to understand and prosecute. Victoria Martins had turned 10 years old just one day before her death. August 23, 2016, should have been a day of celebration, of birthday cake and presents, of a little girl looking forward to starting a new school year and growing another year older. Instead, it became the last day of her short life. Victoria was described by those who knew her as a bright, energetic child with a smile that could light up a room. She loved school, enjoyed spending time with her younger brother, and had dreams like any other 10-year-old. She wanted to grow up to help people, perhaps become a doctor or a teacher. She loved animals and had a particular fondness for cats. Her extended family, particularly her paternal grandparents Pat and John Martins, adored her. They had watched with concern as Victoria's living situation became increasingly unstable, but they never could have imagined the horror that would ultimately befall their granddaughter. Victoria lived with her mother Michelle in the Arroyo Vino apartment complex. The relationship between mother and daughter was complicated, as investigators would later discover. Michelle had been involved with various men over the years, and her priorities seemed to shift away from her children's well-being as time went on. In the weeks leading up to her death, Victoria had been staying with her mother and a man named Fabian Gonzalez, whom Michelle had met on a dating website called Plenty of Fish in July 2016. Gonzalez had quickly moved into the apartment with Michelle, Victoria, and her younger brother, creating a household dynamic that would prove to be dangerous for the children. Neighbors occasionally saw Victoria playing outside or walking with her family, but few had the opportunity to speak with her extensively. Those who did remember her as polite and well-behaved, though perhaps a bit quieter than other children her age. In retrospect, some would wonder if there had been signs of trouble that they should have recognized. Victoria's life was tragically cut short just as she was beginning to discover who she might become. She would never attend middle school, never experience her first dance, never graduate or pursue her dreams of helping others. Her potential remained forever unrealized, stolen by those who should have protected her most. Detective Mark Lewis had been with the Albuquerque Police Department for over 2 decades when he was assigned to the Victoria Martins case. He had investigated hundreds of crimes during his career, from burglaries to homicides, but nothing had prepared him for the complexity and horror of what he would uncover. The initial crime scene processing took hours. Every piece of evidence had to be carefully documented, photographed, and collected. The medical investigator's office was called to handle Victoria's remains with the dignity and care she deserved, despite the condition in which she was found. Meanwhile, Michelle Martins, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly, Gonzalez's cousin, were taken into custody for questioning. The three adults had been present in the apartment, and investigators needed to understand exactly what had happened and who was responsible. The interviews began immediately. Michelle Martins was brought into an interrogation room where detectives hoped to piece together the events of the previous evening. What they learned would shock even experienced investigators who thought they had seen everything. According to the initial statements, the evening of August 23 had begun like many others. Michelle claimed that she, Fabian, and Jessica had been drinking and using drugs. She said that Victoria had been given alcohol as well, which had made the child drowsy and compliant. But as the interview progressed, more disturbing details emerged. Michelle admitted that she had allowed Fabian to have sexual contact with Victoria on previous occasions. She claimed that she enjoyed watching these encounters and that it had become a regular occurrence in their household. On the night of Victoria's death, Michelle said that both Fabian and Jessica had sexually assaulted Victoria while she watched. She claimed that at some point during this assault, Victoria had become unresponsive. Rather than seek medical attention, the three adults had made a decision that would compound their crimes exponentially. They decided to dismember Victoria's body and attempt to destroy the evidence by burning her remains. Detective Lewis listened to these statements with a mixture of professional detachment and barely controlled rage. In his years of law enforcement, he had never encountered such a deliberate and callous disregard for a child's life and dignity. The forensic evidence would need to support or contradict these statements. The medical investigator's office began the difficult process of examining Victoria's remains to determine the exact cause of death and to gather any physical evidence that might be present. Meanwhile, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing the timeline of events on August 23 and the early morning hours of August 24. Cell phone records, security camera footage, and witness statements would all need to be analyzed to build a complete picture of what had occurred. District Attorney Carrie Brandenburg faced one of the most challenging cases of her career when the Victoria Martins investigation was presented to her office. The evidence was horrific, the crime was clearly heinous, but building a case that would result in convictions would require careful legal strategy. Michelle Martins, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly were all charged with multiple felonies, including first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, and tampering with evidence. The charges reflected the severity of their alleged crimes and carried the possibility of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The initial court appearances drew significant media attention. The three defendants sat in the Bernalillo County Courthouse wearing orange jail jumpsuits, their heads down as the charges were read. The courtroom was packed with reporters, members of Victoria's extended family, and concerned citizens who had followed the case from the beginning. Each defendant was appointed legal counsel, and the complex process of plea negotiations and trial preparation began. The case would prove to be one of the most complicated that the district attorney's office had ever prosecuted, with multiple defendants, conflicting statements, and evidence that would challenge both the prosecution and defense teams. Michelle Martins's case was perhaps the most complex of the three. As Victoria's mother, she held the primary responsibility for protecting her daughter, yet she had allegedly facilitated the very abuse that led to Victoria's death. Her defense team would argue that she had been manipulated and coerced by Gonzalez, while the prosecution maintained that she had been a willing participant in her daughter's suffering. Fabian Gonzalez faced the most serious charges, as investigators believed he had been the primary perpetrator of the sexual assault that preceded Victoria's death. His defense team would argue that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that the statements made by Michelle Martins were unreliable due to her own involvement in the crime. Jessica Kelly's role in the crime was less clear initially, but investigators believed she had participated in the sexual assault and had helped with the attempt to destroy evidence afterward. Her defense team would argue that she had been under the influence of drugs and alcohol and had been coerced by the other two defendants. News of Victoria's death spread quickly through Albuquerque and beyond, generating an outpouring of grief and outrage from the community. Vigils were held in Victoria's memory, with hundreds of people gathering to light candles and share their sorrow over the loss of such a young life. The case sparked broader conversations about child protection services, domestic violence, and the systems designed to keep children safe. Many questioned how Victoria's situation had gone unnoticed by authorities, and whether there had been warning signs that should have triggered intervention. Victoria's paternal grandparents, Pat and John Martins, became advocates for their granddaughter's memory and for other children who might be in similar situations. They filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Albuquerque, alleging that authorities had failed to protect Victoria despite having knowledge of her dangerous living situation. The grandparents claimed that Child Protective Services had been contacted about Victoria's welfare on multiple occasions, but that insufficient action had been taken to remove her from her mother's custody. They argued that if proper procedures had been followed, Victoria would still be alive. The lawsuit brought additional attention to the case and raised important questions about how child welfare systems operate and whether they are adequate to protect vulnerable children. The city disputed the allegations, but the lawsuit would continue for years as the criminal cases made their way through the courts. Local schools, churches, and community organizations organized fundraisers and memorial events to honor Victoria's memory. A scholarship fund was established in her name to help other children pursue their educational goals, the dreams that Victoria would never have the chance to achieve. The case also had a profound impact on law enforcement officers and other first responders who had been involved in the investigation. Many sought counseling to help them process the trauma of what they had witnessed and to continue their important work of protecting the community. The forensic analysis of evidence in the Victoria Martins case proved to be both crucial and challenging. The condition of Victoria's remains made it difficult to determine the exact cause of death, though it was clear that she had suffered sexual assault before dying. Dr. Michelle Berry, New Mexico's chief medical investigator, conducted the autopsy with the assistance of several forensic specialists. The examination revealed evidence of both recent and historical sexual abuse, indicating that Victoria had been suffering for some time before her death. The autopsy also revealed that Victoria had alcohol and methamphetamine in her system at the time of her death, supporting the statements that she had been given these substances by the adults who were supposed to be caring for her. However, the dismemberment and burning of Victoria's remains had destroyed much of the physical evidence that might have provided clearer answers about exactly how she died and who was directly responsible for her death. This would prove to be a significant challenge for prosecutors as they built their cases against the three defendants. DNA evidence was collected from various locations in the apartment and from the defendants themselves, but the results were not as conclusive as investigators had hoped. The passage of time between the crime and the discovery, combined with the attempts to destroy evidence, had compromised much of the physical evidence. Cell phone records and digital forensics became increasingly important to the investigation. Detectives were able to track the movements of Michelle Martins and Fabian Gonzalez on the night of Victoria's death, using cell tower data and GPS information to establish a timeline of their activities. The digital evidence showed that the two had left the apartment several times during the evening of August 23, visiting various locations around Albuquerque before returning to the apartment where Victoria was found dead the next morning. This timeline would become crucial to understanding exactly when Victoria had died and who had been present at the time. As the case progressed through the legal system, the charges against the defendants evolved based on the available evidence and the strength of the prosecution's case. What had initially seemed like a straightforward murder prosecution became increasingly complicated as forensic results came in and witness statements were analyzed. In 2018, nearly 2 years after Victoria's death, prosecutors made the difficult decision to reduce some of the charges against the defendants. The murder charges against Michelle Martins and Jessica Kelly were dropped as part of plea negotiations, though they still faced serious felony charges related to child abuse and evidence tampering. District Attorney Raul Torres, who had taken over the case from his predecessor, explained that the decision was based on the available evidence and the likelihood of securing convictions at trial. While the crime was undoubtedly heinous, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that specific defendants had committed murder was challenging given the forensic evidence available. Michelle Martins ultimately pleaded guilty to charges of child abuse resulting in death and evidence tampering. As part of her plea agreement, she admitted that she had failed to protect Victoria from sexual abuse and had allowed the child to be harmed by others in their household. During her plea hearing, Michelle showed little emotion as she acknowledged her role in her daughter's death. The courtroom was filled with Victoria's extended family members, many of whom wept as they listened to the details of how Victoria had suffered. Jessica Kelly also entered into plea negotiations, ultimately accepting responsibility for her role in the crime. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison after admitting to charges related to child abuse and evidence tampering. The plea agreements were controversial, with many community members feeling that the defendants should face more severe punishment for their crimes. However, prosecutors argued that the agreements ensured that the defendants would spend significant time in prison while avoiding the uncertainty of a trial where acquittals were possible. While Michelle Martins and Jessica Kelly resolved their cases through plea agreements, Fabian Gonzalez chose to maintain his innocence and proceed to trial. His case would become the most closely watched of the three, as many viewed him as the primary perpetrator of the crimes against Victoria. The trial began in July 2022, nearly 6 years after Victoria's death. The delay had been caused by various factors, including changes in legal representation, pre-trial motions, and the COVID-19 pandemic that had disrupted court schedules across the country. Prosecutor David Waymire presented the state's case against Gonzalez, arguing that he had been the ringleader in the abuse and murder of Victoria. The prosecution relied heavily on the statements made by Michelle Martins during her initial police interview, as well as forensic evidence and cell phone data that placed Gonzalez at the apartment during the time when Victoria was killed. The prosecution's case was challenging because much of the evidence was circumstantial, and their primary witness, Michelle Martins, was herself a convicted felon who had admitted to failing to protect her daughter. Defense attorneys argued that Michelle's statements were unreliable and that she had been trying to shift blame away from herself. Defense attorney Stephen Aarons presented a different version of events, suggesting that his client had been made a scapegoat for crimes that he did not commit. The defense argued that the physical evidence did not definitively prove that Gonzalez had sexually assaulted or killed Victoria, and that the case against him was based largely on the unreliable statements of co-defendants who had their own motivations for blaming him. The trial lasted several weeks, with dozens of witnesses testifying about various aspects of the case. Law enforcement officers described the crime scene and the investigation process, forensic experts explained their findings, and Victoria's family members provided heart-wrenching testimony about the impact of her death. After deliberating for several days, the jury in the Fabian Gonzalez trial reached their verdict. They found him guilty on multiple charges, including child abuse resulting in death, but acquitted him of the most serious charge of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with mixed reactions from Victoria's family and the community. While many were relieved that Gonzalez had been convicted of serious felonies, others felt that the jury should have found him guilty of murder given the severity of the crime. Judge Catherine Begay sentenced Gonzalez to the maximum penalty allowed under the law for the charges of which he was convicted. The sentence ensured that he would spend decades in prison, though it fell short of the life sentence that many had hoped to see. Following the conclusion of the criminal cases, attention turned to the civil lawsuit filed by Victoria's grandparents against the city of Albuquerque. The lawsuit alleged that city employees, including social workers and police officers, had failed to adequately investigate reports of abuse in Michelle Martins's household. The civil case would continue for several more years, as attorneys for both sides gathered evidence and prepared for trial. The outcome of the civil lawsuit would have significant implications for how child protective services operate in Albuquerque and potentially in other jurisdictions across the country. Meanwhile, Victoria's memory lived on through the various memorial efforts that had been established in her honor. The scholarship fund continued to grow, helping other children pursue educational opportunities that Victoria would never have. Community organizations continued to hold annual remembrance events, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. The Victoria Martins case raised profound questions about the nature of justice and the systems designed to protect children from harm. While the defendants were ultimately held accountable for their crimes, many felt that the punishments did not adequately reflect the severity of what they had done to an innocent child. The case also highlighted gaps in the child protection system that allowed Victoria's abuse to continue undetected for months. Despite multiple contacts with various agencies, no effective intervention had occurred to remove Victoria from her dangerous living situation. In response to the case, New Mexico legislators introduced new laws designed to strengthen child protection services and improve coordination between various agencies. These reforms aimed to ensure that future cases like Victoria's would be identified and addressed before they could result in tragedy. Law enforcement agencies also implemented new training programs for officers and detectives who investigate crimes against children. The emotional toll of these cases on first responders was recognized as a serious concern, and resources were made available to help them cope with the trauma of their work. The case had a lasting impact on the Albuquerque community and beyond. It served as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of vigilance in protecting them from those who would do them harm. Victoria's extended family continued to advocate for changes in the system, speaking at conferences and meetings to share their experience and push for reforms. Their work ensured that Victoria's death would serve a purpose beyond the criminal convictions it generated. As we conclude this examination of the Victoria Martins case, it's important to remember that behind all the legal proceedings, evidence analysis, and policy discussions was a 10-year-old girl whose life was cut tragically short. Victoria Martins should have had the chance to grow up, to attend school, to make friends, to discover her talents and pursue her dreams. She should have experienced the joy of adolescence, the excitement of graduation, the satisfaction of building a career and perhaps a family of her own. Instead, she became the victim of unimaginable cruelty at the hands of those who should have protected her most. Her death shocked a community and exposed flaws in systems that were supposed to keep children safe. The quest for justice in Victoria's case took years to complete, and even then, many felt that true justice remained elusive. The defendants received significant prison sentences, but no punishment could truly account for the life that was lost and the suffering that Victoria endured. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy of Victoria's story lies not in the criminal convictions or the civil lawsuits, but in the changes that her death inspired. New laws were passed, new training programs were implemented, and new awareness was raised about the signs of child abuse and the importance of intervention. Every child who is saved from abuse because of increased vigilance, every social worker who receives better training because of lessons learned from this case, every law enforcement officer who is better equipped to investigate these crimes, they are all part of Victoria's legacy. The systems designed to protect children are imperfect and always will be, but they can be improved. The tragedy of Victoria Martins serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, reminding us all of our collective responsibility to watch out for the most vulnerable members of our society. Victoria's story is one of profound sadness, but also of the enduring power of memory and the possibility of positive change arising from even the darkest circumstances. In remembering her, we honor not only her life but our commitment to ensuring that other children do not suffer as she did. As the years pass and the details of this case fade from headlines, Victoria Martins remains more than just the victim of a terrible crime. She is a reminder of the preciousness of childhood, the importance of protection, and the ongoing work required to build a world where all children can grow up safe, loved, and free from harm. Her story continues to resonate with those who investigate crimes against children, those who work in child protection, and those who simply believe that every child deserves a chance at life. In that continuation, in that impact, Victoria's brief life finds a meaning that transcends the circumstances of her death. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey back to a cold January evening in 1984, to a quiet neighborhood in Lakewood, Colorado, where the life of Patricia Louise Smith would come to a violent and tragic end. This is a story that remained unsolved for over 3 decades, a puzzle that would eventually connect to one of the most notorious crime sprees in Colorado history. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me tell you about Patricia, and the long road to justice that followed her death. Patricia Louise Smith was 50 years old in January of 1984, a woman who had built a life around creativity and beauty. She worked as an interior designer, spending her days transforming spaces, bringing warmth and elegance into other people's homes. Those who knew her described her as gentle and artistic, the kind of person who saw potential where others saw only empty rooms. Patricia lived alone in a modest apartment in Lakewood, a suburb west of Denver that in 1984 still retained much of its small-town charm. Tree-lined streets, well-kept homes, and the kind of community where neighbors knew each other by name. It was the sort of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, where the most serious crime was usually a stolen bicycle or teenage pranks. Her apartment was a reflection of her profession and personality, carefully decorated, each piece chosen with an artist's eye. Friends would later tell investigators that Patricia took pride in her home, that it was her sanctuary after long days spent working with clients, measuring rooms, and selecting fabrics and furniture. On the evening of January 10, 1984, Patricia followed her usual routine. She had spent the day working, perhaps meeting with clients or sourcing materials for upcoming projects. The winter cold that had settled over Colorado was particularly bitter that year, and like many residents, Patricia was likely looking forward to the warmth and comfort of her home. As darkness fell over Lakewood that Tuesday evening, Patricia was settling into what should have been another ordinary night. The television was on, investigators would later find it still playing when her body was discovered. She had changed into comfortable clothes, perhaps made herself some tea or a light dinner. The routine of a woman who lived alone, comfortable in her solitude, secure in her familiar space. But sometime during those quiet evening hours, Patricia's sanctuary became a crime scene. Someone had entered her apartment, bringing with them a violence so sudden and brutal that it would shake the entire Denver metropolitan area. What happened to Patricia Smith in those dark hours would remain a mystery for decades. But the evidence left behind painted a picture of terror and brutality that investigators would never forget. The next morning, when Patricia failed to show up for work and didn't answer her phone, concern began to grow. Patricia was known for her reliability. She wasn't the type to simply not show up without calling. When worried friends or colleagues went to check on her, they made a discovery that would haunt them forever. Patricia had been murdered in her own home, beaten to death with a hammer in an attack of shocking violence. The crime scene was devastating, blood spatter on the walls, signs of a struggle, and evidence that Patricia had fought desperately for her life. But perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators determined that Patricia had also been sexually assaulted before her death. The weapon, a hammer, was particularly chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion using whatever was at hand. The killer had brought this weapon with them, suggesting premeditation and a coldly calculated brutality. The hammer would become a crucial piece of evidence, though it would be decades before investigators understood its true significance. The Lakewood Police Department, not accustomed to such violent crimes, threw every resource they had at the Patricia Smith case. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, looking for witnesses, checking for signs of forced entry, interviewing anyone who might have known Patricia or had reason to be in the area. What they found was deeply troubling. There were no signs of forced entry into Patricia's apartment. This suggested either that Patricia had known her killer and let them in, or that the perpetrator was skilled at gaining entry without leaving obvious traces. The apartment showed signs of being searched, though it was unclear what, if anything, had been taken. Investigators collected DNA evidence from the scene, bodily fluids left by the attacker. In 1984, DNA analysis was still in its infancy, not yet the powerful tool it would become. The evidence was carefully preserved, but at the time, there was no way to use it to identify a suspect. It would sit in storage, waiting for technology to catch up. The brutality of the attack suggested this was not the work of a first-time killer. The methodical nature of the violence, the use of a specific weapon, the sexual assault, all of these factors pointed to someone who had likely killed before, or who would kill again. Detectives worked tirelessly, following every lead, no matter how small. They interviewed Patricia's clients, her neighbors, anyone who had been in contact with her in the days leading up to her death. They looked into her personal life, searching for anyone who might have harbored ill will toward the quiet interior designer. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, the case began to grow cold. Without modern forensic tools, without a suspect, and with few leads to pursue, investigators found themselves at a dead end. Patricia Smith's murder file was placed in the cold case division, but the detectives involved never forgot her, never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, justice would be served. Just 6 days after Patricia Smith's murder, another family in the Denver area would face unimaginable horror. The Bennett family, Bruce, Deborah, and their 7-year-old daughter Melissa, were attacked in their Aurora home in a crime that bore striking similarities to Patricia's murder. The weapon was a hammer. The violence was extreme and senseless. The sexual assault of the female victims. The forced entry into a family home. Even the timing, both attacks occurred in the dark hours of the night when victims would be most vulnerable. The Bennett family attack was even more devastating in its scope. Bruce Bennett, 27 years old, was beaten to death as he tried to protect his family. His wife Deborah, 26, was sexually assaulted and murdered. Their daughter Melissa suffered the same fate. Only their 3-year-old daughter Vanessa survived, though she was left with severe injuries that would affect her for the rest of her life. The similarities between the Patricia Smith murder and the Bennett family massacre were too numerous to ignore. Investigators began to suspect they were dealing with a serial killer, someone who was escalating in violence and frequency. The media dubbed the perpetrator the Hammer Killer, a name that would strike fear into the hearts of Colorado residents for years to come. But despite the clear connections between the crimes, investigators still had no suspect. The killer seemed to vanish as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only devastation and questions that would persist for decades. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, investigators continued to work both cases. New detectives were assigned as older ones retired. Files were reviewed and re-reviewed. Witnesses were re-interviewed. New forensic techniques were applied to old evidence as they became available. The cases became legendary within Colorado law enforcement circles: the murders that got away, the killer who disappeared. Every few years, there would be a new theory, a new lead, a new hope that this might be the breakthrough that would finally solve the case. Patricia Smith's family never gave up hope. They attended every court hearing related to similar cases, hoping to find some connection. They kept her memory alive, speaking to reporters whenever the anniversary of her death rolled around, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The Bennett family's surviving daughter, Vanessa, grew up in the shadow of that terrible night. Though she had been too young to remember the attack clearly, she lived with the physical and emotional scars. She, too, became an advocate for justice, speaking publicly about the need to catch her family's killer. In 2002, 18 years after Patricia Smith's murder, DNA technology had advanced enough that investigators decided to run the biological evidence through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. This database allowed law enforcement agencies to compare DNA evidence from unsolved cases with DNA profiles from convicted offenders. The results confirmed what investigators had long suspected: the DNA from Patricia Smith's murder matched the DNA from the Bennett family killings. The same person had committed both crimes. But still, there was no match to a known offender. The killer's DNA profile sat in the database, waiting for a match that might never come. Years passed. The original investigators on the case retired. New generations of detectives took over the files. The cases remained open, but hope for a resolution began to fade. Patricia Smith and the Bennett family had become part of Colorado's collection of unsolved mysteries, cold cases that might never see justice. But the families never stopped hoping. And crucially, the evidence never stopped waiting. The breakthrough finally came in 2018, 34 years after Patricia Smith's murder. Advances in DNA technology and database searches led investigators to a name, Alex Christopher Ewing. Ewing was already serving time in Nevada for a similar hammer attack that had occurred shortly after the Colorado murders. In August 1984, just months after the Colorado attacks, Ewing had broken into the home of an elderly couple in Henderson, Nevada. Using a hammer, his signature weapon, he had brutally attacked both victims. The husband died, and the wife barely survived. Ewing was caught, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. But in 1984, DNA technology wasn't advanced enough to connect the Nevada attack to the Colorado murders. Ewing had been sitting in a Nevada prison for over 30 years while investigators in Colorado searched for Patricia Smith's killer, never knowing he was already behind bars. When DNA technology finally made the connection, everything fell into place. The timeline fit. The method of operation was identical. The geographical progression made sense, a killer fleeing Colorado for Nevada after a string of increasingly violent attacks. Alex Christopher Ewing was 43 years old at the time of Patricia Smith's murder, a drifter with a history of burglary and violence. He had no connection to Patricia, no reason to target her specifically. She was, in the most tragic sense, simply unlucky enough to cross paths with a predator who had chosen her apartment for reasons that would never be fully understood. Bringing Ewing back to Colorado to face charges for the Patricia Smith murder and the Bennett family killings was a complex legal process. Ewing fought extradition, knowing that Colorado prosecutors were seeking the death penalty. Legal battles stretched on for months as attorneys argued jurisdiction and evidence. Finally, in March 2020, Alex Ewing arrived in Colorado to face justice for crimes he had committed 36 years earlier. But the legal process was further delayed by the coronavirus pandemic, pushing the trials back even further. For the families of the victims, particularly Patricia Smith's relatives and Vanessa Bennett, now an adult with children of her own, this delay was particularly painful. They had waited so long for answers, for closure, for justice. Each postponement felt like another injustice. But they had waited this long. They could wait a little longer if it meant finally getting the resolution they had hoped for. In 2021, Alex Ewing finally stood trial for the Bennett family murders. The evidence against him was overwhelming: DNA evidence, forensic testimony, and the clear pattern of behavior that connected him to multiple hammer attacks across 2 states. During the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of Ewing as a cold-blooded killer who had specifically targeted families in their homes. They described his method: breaking into houses in the early morning hours when victims would be most vulnerable, using a hammer as his weapon of choice, committing sexual assaults before murdering his victims. The defense tried to argue that the DNA evidence was contaminated or unreliable, that the passage of 37 years made a fair trial impossible. But the evidence was too strong, the connections too clear. Ewing was found guilty on all counts related to the Bennett family murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Finally, the Bennett family had justice. Vanessa Bennett, who had survived that terrible night as a 3-year-old, was able to face her family's killer and tell him how his actions had affected her life. But Patricia Smith's case was still pending. In 2022, Ewing went on trial specifically for her murder. By this time, he was 61 years old, graying and aged by nearly 4 decades in prison. But prosecutors were determined to ensure that Patricia's murder was also properly adjudicated, that her life was honored with its own trial and verdict. The evidence in Patricia's case was just as strong as it had been in the Bennett family trial. DNA evidence conclusively linked Ewing to her murder and sexual assault. Forensic experts testified about the pattern of hammer blows that had killed her. Investigators who had worked her case for decades finally got to present their evidence in court. Ewing's defense was similar to his previous trial, challenging the DNA evidence, arguing that too much time had passed for a fair trial. But once again, the evidence was overwhelming. On April 7, 2022, 38 years after Patricia Smith's murder, a jury found Alex Christopher Ewing guilty on all counts. He was convicted of first-degree murder after deliberation, first-degree murder in the commission of a sexual assault, and sexual assault charges. For Patricia's family members who were still alive, for the friends who had never forgotten her, for the investigators who had carried her case for decades, this verdict was everything they had hoped for. Patricia Louise Smith finally had justice. The Patricia Smith case teaches us several important lessons about justice, persistence, and the evolution of criminal investigation. For 38 years, Patricia's killer walked free, first on the streets, then in a Nevada prison for different crimes, always one step ahead of the Colorado investigators who sought him. But the case also demonstrates the incredible advances in forensic science that have revolutionized criminal investigation. The DNA evidence that was collected in 1984 but couldn't be properly analyzed until decades later was ultimately what solved the case. Evidence preservation and the patience of investigators paid off in the end. The case shows us the importance of never giving up on victims, no matter how much time passes. Patricia Smith's life mattered in 1984, and it still mattered in 2022 when her killer was finally convicted. Her memory was honored by every investigator who kept her file active, every family member who spoke her name to reporters, every person who refused to let her become just another unsolved case. Understanding Alex Ewing's pattern helps us make sense of what happened to Patricia Smith. Ewing was what criminal psychologists call a organized serial killer, someone who plans their attacks, brings their own weapons, and follows a specific ritual or method. His choice of weapon, a hammer, was significant. Hammers are readily available, don't require special knowledge to use effectively, and can be disposed of easily. But they also indicate a particularly brutal and personal form of violence. A hammer attack requires the killer to be close to their victim, to look them in the eye, to continue striking even as blood flows. Ewing's choice to attack people in their homes showed his desire for control and his understanding of vulnerability. Homes represent safety and security. By violating that space, Ewing was inflicting not just physical harm but psychological trauma. Even survivors of his attacks would never feel truly safe in their own homes again. The sexual component of his crimes revealed another layer to his pathology. Ewing wasn't just killing for the sake of killing, he was asserting dominance, inflicting humiliation, satisfying twisted psychological needs that drove him to commit increasingly violent acts. Today, Alex Christopher Ewing is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole for his crimes in Colorado, in addition to his existing life sentence in Nevada. He is now in his 60s, a man who spent the prime years of his life either committing horrific crimes or sitting in prison cells. The families of his victims have found some measure of peace in his convictions, though they will always carry the scars of what he took from them. Vanessa Bennett has become an advocate for victims' rights, using her platform to speak about the importance of supporting survivors and never giving up on cold cases. Patricia Smith's legacy lives on in the work of the investigators who never forgot her case, in the forensic advances that finally brought her justice, and in the reminder that every victim deserves to be remembered and honored. The Patricia Smith case is also a testament to the incredible advances in forensic science over the past 4 decades. In 1984, DNA analysis was virtually unknown to most law enforcement agencies. The biological evidence collected from Patricia's apartment was preserved but couldn't be properly analyzed with the technology available at the time. The development of STR, short tandem repeat, analysis in the 1990s revolutionized DNA testing, allowing scientists to develop profiles from smaller, more degraded samples. The creation of CODIS, the National DNA Database, meant that evidence from cold cases could be compared against DNA profiles from convicted offenders across the country. Even more recently, the use of genetic genealogy, the same technology that helped catch the Golden State Killer, has opened up new possibilities for solving cold cases. Investigators can now use publicly available genetic databases to identify suspects even when their DNA isn't already in the criminal justice system. Patricia Smith's case was solved using more traditional DNA analysis, but it paved the way for these newer techniques. Every cold case that gets solved using advanced forensic methods owes something to cases like Patricia's, where evidence was carefully preserved and investigators never gave up hope. What can we learn from Patricia Smith's story? First, the importance of evidence preservation. The biological evidence that eventually convicted Alex Ewing was collected in 1984 but not properly analyzed until 2018. If that evidence had been lost or degraded over the decades, Ewing might never have been connected to Patricia's murder. Second, the value of persistent investigation. Multiple generations of investigators worked on Patricia's case, each building on the work of those who came before. Cold cases require this kind of institutional memory and continuous effort. Third, the power of advancing technology. DNA analysis has revolutionized criminal investigation, but so have improvements in fingerprint analysis, ballistics testing, and digital forensics. Evidence that seems useless today might hold the key to solving a case decades from now. Finally, Patricia's case reminds us of the importance of supporting victims' families. Patricia's relatives never stopped advocating for justice, never stopped speaking her name to reporters, never let her become just another statistic. Their persistence kept public attention on the case and pressure on investigators to keep working toward a solution. Behind all the talk of DNA analysis and legal proceedings, it's important to remember the human cost of Patricia Smith's murder. She was a 50-year-old woman with dreams, relationships, and contributions to make to the world. Her death didn't just end her life, it sent ripples through her family, her friends, her community. The interior designer who would never again transform a client's living space into something beautiful. The friend who would never again share a cup of coffee and conversation. The family member who would be missed at holidays and birthdays for decades to come. Alex Ewing didn't just take Patricia's life that night in January 1984. He took all the years she would have lived, all the relationships she would have formed, all the joy she would have experienced and given to others. He took a piece of everyone who loved her, leaving them with wounds that would never fully heal. This is the true cost of violent crime, not just the immediate victim, but everyone whose life is touched by the loss. Patricia's story is ultimately about more than DNA evidence and legal proceedings. It's about a life cut short and the long journey towards some measure of justice and peace. The Hammer killer cases, including Patricia Smith's murder, had a profound impact on the Denver metropolitan area. In 1984, random violent crime was less common than it is today, and the idea that someone could break into homes and murder entire families shook the community to its core. Home security systems became more popular. People started locking doors that had previously been left open. The sense of safety and security that had characterized suburban communities like Lakewood and Aurora was permanently damaged. The cases also had a significant impact on law enforcement in Colorado. The investigation into these crimes led to improvements in evidence collection and preservation, better coordination between different police departments, and increased training in forensic techniques. The long delay in solving these cases also highlighted the importance of cold case units. Today, most major police departments have dedicated investigators who work exclusively on unsolved cases, applying new technologies and fresh perspectives to old evidence. Patricia Smith's case perfectly illustrates how the relationship between technology and justice has evolved over the past several decades. The evidence that would eventually convict her killer existed from the very beginning, but the technology to properly analyze it didn't exist until decades later. This raises interesting questions about current cases. What evidence are we collecting today that we can't properly analyze yet? What future technologies might unlock the secrets hidden in today's unsolved cases? It also highlights the importance of proper evidence storage and chain of custody procedures. The biological evidence from Patricia's case had to remain viable for over 30 years before it could be properly analyzed. Any break in the chain of custody, any contamination or degradation, could have made justice impossible. While Patricia Smith didn't survive to see her killer brought to justice, Vanessa Bennett did. The 3-year-old who survived the hammer attack that killed her parents and sister grew up to become a powerful advocate for victims' rights and cold case investigations. Vanessa's story is a reminder that the effects of violent crime extend far beyond the immediate victims. She lived her entire life in the shadow of that terrible night in 1984, dealing with physical injuries, psychological trauma, and the weight of being the sole survivor of her family's murder. But she also chose to use her experience to help others. She spoke at conferences about victims' rights, advocated for better support services for crime survivors, and kept public attention focused on cold cases like her family's murder and Patricia Smith's case. When Alex Ewing was finally brought to trial, Vanessa was there to face him, to tell him how his actions had affected her life, to represent not just herself but all the victims of his violence. Her presence in that courtroom was a powerful reminder that justice, even when delayed, still matters. Throughout this story, we've touched on the dedication of the investigators who worked Patricia Smith's case for decades. These men and women carried her file from case to case, from department to department, never giving up hope that someday they would find her killer. Detective work on cold cases requires a special kind of persistence. There are no immediate rewards, no quick victories. Progress is measured in small increments, a new piece of evidence preserved, a witness re-interviewed, a new technology applied to old samples. The investigators who worked on Patricia's case knew that they might never live to see it solved. Some of the original detectives who collected evidence at her apartment in 1984 had retired or died by the time Alex Ewing was finally convicted in 2022. But they all played a crucial role in eventually bringing her killer to justice. Their dedication is a reminder that law enforcement, at its best, is about service to victims and their families. It's about the promise that no matter how much time passes, someone will continue fighting for justice. As we reach the end of Patricia Smith's story, it's worth reflecting on what her case tells us about justice, time, and the human condition. For 38 years, her killer lived with the knowledge of what he had done. For 38 years, her family lived with the pain of not knowing who had taken her from them. But in the end, truth won out. Science and persistence combined to identify Alex Ewing as Patricia's killer. The evidence she unknowingly left behind, the biological material that would eventually seal her killer's fate, became her voice from beyond the grave, finally able to point the finger at the man who had taken her life. Patricia Louise Smith was more than just a victim. She was an interior designer who brought beauty into people's homes. She was a friend, a family member, a neighbor. She was a 50-year-old woman with a full life ahead of her, cut short by a stranger's violence. But she was also, ultimately, a catalyst for justice. Her case helped advance forensic science, influenced law enforcement procedures, and demonstrated the power of never giving up on the search for truth. In death, she became part of something larger than herself, the ongoing human struggle to find meaning in tragedy and justice in an often unjust world. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Patricia Smith. Remember that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still prevail. Remember that every victim deserves to be honored and remembered. And remember that even in our darkest moments, there are people working tirelessly to bring light to the darkness. Her story is complete now. Her killer has been caught, tried, and convicted. She can finally rest in peace, knowing that Alex Ewing will spend the rest of his life behind bars for what he did to her and so many others. And somewhere in Colorado tonight, investigators are working on other cold cases, other Patricia Smiths waiting for their moment of justice. Because that's what we owe to the victims, our persistence, our dedication, and our promise that they will never be forgotten. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.